When winter settles in, truly settles in, it changes the way the world sounds. The nights grow longer, the dark grows heavier, and sometimes if you're awake late enough, alone enough, you begin to hear things you were never meant to hear. Good evening, wanderers of the sleepless hours. Welcome back to Dread, your quiet refuge for the strange, the forgotten, and the voices that hide between the seconds of the night. Tonight's episode is a long one. A slow-burning descent into 5 December stories, true accounts, or so their tellers swear, about isolation, echoes that shouldn't exist, and the things winter uncovers when no one is watching. You'll hear about the woman alone in a snowbound watchtower who realized the shape watching her wasn't a man at all. The hunter who discovered his cabin had learned to repeat his words with someone else's voice, and the toll bridge worker who kept seeing the same truck pass him, though its driver had been dead for 10 years. Winter has always been a season of silence, but silence, as you'll soon hear, has a voice of its own. So settle in, dim the lights, and let the cold come a little closer. Tonight, we begin our journey into 5 true December horror stories. Stories best heard in the dark, alone, when the world has gone still enough for the truth to speak. Story 1. December in the mountains has a way of swallowing sound, of folding the world into layers of white and gray until everything feels distant enough that even your own thoughts echo a little before finding their way back to you. On the morning I arrived at the Ridgeview Fire Lookout, my final winter rotation of the year, the sun was only a pale smudge behind a ceiling of unmoving clouds, and the forest below looked less like a forest and more like the shadow of one, each tree softened by the fresh snowstorm that had rolled in overnight. The air tasted metallic and clean, sharp enough that every breath made the inside of my nose sting. I remember thinking that December always felt too quiet up here, even for a place that was meant to be quiet. The lookout tower stood alone at the top of a narrow ridge, a thin line of metal and wood framed by miles of wilderness. Just beyond the bluffs, to the west, was where the storms came from. Low, slow, drifting systems that dragged curtains of snow through the PNW valleys like someone was pulling a blanket over the world. When I turned off the engine of my truck, the sudden absence of the heater's rumble left a kind of ringing in my ears, like the mountain was holding its breath while waiting for me to step out. The wind blew across the ridgeline in short, dry bursts, brushing crystals of snow off the guardrails. They glittered briefly before vanishing into the drifts below. I carried my duffel and supply crates up the narrow stairs, each step creaking with a tired groan that matched the ache in my shoulders. 4 months earlier, back in August, the tower had been buzzing with radio calls and smoke reports. Now, in December, it felt like a skeleton of itself, thinner, colder, more vulnerable to the weight of the weather. That vulnerability seeped into me almost immediately. I'd worked alone up here for 3 winters, but the first morning always took an adjustment, like slipping back into an old habit that remembers you more clearly than you remember it. Inside, the air was colder than outside. I flipped on the propane heater, listened to the faint click, click, click before the blue flame flickered to life, and set my gloves next to it to dry the melted snow. The small room warmed slowly, breathing out little groans as the wood expanded. I walked the perimeter, checking the windows, making sure the shutters hadn't warped in the last freeze. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed still. It always does on the first day. What people don't realize about fire lookouts is that winter rotations aren't glamorous. There's no sweeping romanticism, no poetic solitude, just a lot of wind, a lot of cold, and a lot of silence that eventually turns the cabin into a sounding chamber for your thoughts. But there's something else too. A strange pressure in the stillness, a feeling like the world has narrowed itself down to the few square feet you occupy. I've never been able to describe it without sounding superstitious, but I've always believed the mountains pay attention to you more in winter. Maybe it's because you're one of the few things still alive up here. By the afternoon, a new storm had begun to gather. Darker clouds rolled low over the far ridge, their undersides bruised purple. The NOAA reports had warned about heavier snowfall over the next few days, and I planned to ride it out like usual, check the radio, keep to the schedule, stay inside when visibility dropped too low. But as the first flakes drifted in a diagonal sheet across the glass, something caught my eye far across the valley, a darker shape, standing on the opposing ridge. At first, I assumed it was just a tall snag, one of those fire-killed trunks that refuses to fall even years after the burn. But this one, it wasn't charred. It wasn't bent the way dead trees usually are in high wind. It looked too clean, too upright, too definite against the gray horizon. I leaned closer to the window, squinting through the falling snow. It looked like a person. A small jolt of adrenaline flickered in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a kind of alertness, like my mind was trying to catch up with what I thought I was seeing. No one should have been out there. The trailheads had all been closed for the season. The snowpack was already too deep for any casual hiker, and the nearest ranger outpost was 20 miles downhill. Whoever or whatever I was looking at shouldn't have been able to stand on that ridge unless they had crossed miles of storm-thickened wilderness on foot. But even then, even if someone somehow made the climb, why stand perfectly still? I waited for the shape to move, to shift weight, to turn, to do anything human. It didn't. Instead, the wind pushed another heavy gust across the valley, and the snow thickened between us like someone was slowly pulling a curtain over the scene. By the time I blinked, the shape was swallowed in white again, as if the mountain had decided I wasn't supposed to see it yet. I stepped back from the window, telling myself it had been nothing more than a trick of perspective. A broken antenna from the old survey station out there, a rock spire, a weather-bent signpost from some forgotten trail. But the unease lingered, spreading through my chest like cold water. Because here's the thing, I've seen antenna masts bent in storms. I've seen burnt snags twisting into strange silhouettes. I've seen rocks that look like people until the sun shifts, but none of them ever gave me the distinct and unmistakable impression of being watched, and that's what stayed with me, even after the snow thickened. Even after I turned on the radio and checked the frequencies. Even after I heated a pot of lentil soup on the camp stove and tried to distract myself with a paperback mystery I'd already read twice. That feeling of eyes across the valley, unmoving, unblinking, lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind like a splinter. A small one, easy to ignore at first, but impossible to forget once you feel it slide in. That night, when the storm finally settled into a steady, suffocating white, I woke 3 separate times. Not because of the wind, not because of the cold, but because each time I opened my eyes, I had the same impression that something was directly across from me on the other ridge, standing in the identical spot, facing the lookout tower, waiting for the snowfall to break, waiting for me to look again. And every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't help thinking, what if it wasn't waiting for me at all? What if it was waiting for the right moment to move? The storm broke sometime before dawn on the 4th morning. I didn't hear it end, not really. Instead, I woke to the absence of sound, the kind of deadened quiet that only happens after a heavy snow has smothered every surface it touches. The heater hummed faintly in the corner, a weak, persistent reminder that the lookout tower still had some warmth to give, but beyond that, nothing. No wind brushing against the shutters, no branches cracking in the cold, no shifting drifts, just a silence so complete it almost felt artificial. I stayed in my sleeping bag for several minutes, listening, waiting for something familiar, creak of settling wood, a whistle through the vents to break the stillness. When nothing did, I finally forced myself up, each movement slow and stiff from the dry air and uneven sleep. The floorboards were cold enough that my socks prickled with the temperature change as soon as I stood. Outside, the sky was still dark, but not storm dark, just early morning dark, with a faint blue haze bleeding into the edges of the horizon. Something in that blue light told me the snowfall had been heavy, heavier than expected. I moved to the eastern window first, rubbing the glass with the sleeve of my sweater to clear the condensation. The view opened like a curtain parting, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The entire valley below was unrecognizable. It looked less like a landscape and more like a blank canvas poured over the world, smooth, unbroken, unmarred by any tracks or trails. Even the tallest firs bowed under the weight of the snow. Their branches curved downward in sweeping arcs like silent, frozen gestures. The ridge across from me, the one I'd stared at for the past 3 days, was no longer a dark line but a white plateau, so soft and even that it almost looked illuminated from within. A day after a storm like this, you can normally see small avalanches, or wind-carved ripples, or some sign that the weather had passed through with force. But this looked too perfect. Like the storm hadn't just come through, it had sculpted the entire valley into something unnaturally smooth. I scanned the opposing ridge, my eyes tracing the place where I'd seen the silhouette before. The space was empty, bare, clean, a blank stretch of white with no protruding shape, no dark spine of metal, no figure standing sentinel against the storm. A rational part of me, small, tired, but still functioning, felt relieved. Whatever I'd seen before had probably been some twisted piece of equipment reflecting the last before storm light. A bent antenna, a forgotten pole, a snow-laden snag. The storm must have knocked it down, buried it, erased the illusion. That's what I told myself. But the deeper, instinctive part of me wasn't convinced, because even though the shape was gone, the absence of it felt wrong. The ridge looked emptier than it should have, as if removing that silhouette left behind a space that wasn't meant to be empty. I turned away from the window before that thought could settle itself, busying my hands with the morning routine radio check, temperature log, barometric reading. The radio fizzed with soft static, but no new messages. The barometer had stabilized. The tower warmed slowly, the heater clicking as it cycled. Everything should have felt normal. It didn't. Around mid-morning, after a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, I set out to clear the snow around the base of the tower. It was part of the usual post-storm duties: keep the access route visible, maintain the emergency perimeter, check that no ice had overloaded the support beams. The stairs groaned under my weight as I made my way down, each step coated with an inch of new powder. My breath made small clouds in the air, drifting upward and disappearing into the pale sky. When I reached the bottom platform, I hesitated. The snow around the tower was untouched, perfectly untouched. Not even the faint disturbance of wind-scattered frost. No animal tracks, no settling impressions. Just a level, pristine sheet of white that stretched outward in a flawless circle. For a place normally teeming with winter wildlife, rabbits, deer, even the occasional elk, this level of untouched snow wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. Something nudged at the back of my spine, a faint pulse of awareness, of being observed, not watched, observed. I lifted my head slowly, my eyes drifting across the valley to that same ridge, empty. But the emptiness itself felt like a presence, like something had stepped aside just long enough for me to look, only to return the moment I turned away. I moved around the tower, shovel in hand, packing down the snow into manageable pathways. The rhythm of the work helped, the scrape of metal against ice, the crunch beneath my boots, the exhale of exertion for brief stretches of time. It allowed me to forget the ridge entirely until I reached the far side of the tower, the side that faced the opposing ridge directly, the side I'd been unconsciously avoiding. I rounded the corner, shovel dragging behind me, and froze so abruptly that the breath hitching in my throat crystallized in the air. The air barely visible through the clearing haze was a depression in the snow, not from an animal, not from wind, not from falling ice. It was a single, elongated indentation in the perfect white shape, subtle but unmistakable, positioned directly beneath the lookout's north-facing window, as if something had stood there for a long time. No tracks leading to it, no tracks leading away, just one isolated mark, pressed into the snow without any explanation for how it was made. My heartbeat quickened, a slow, deliberate thud against my ribs. I crouched down, squinting at the indentation. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly. Too wide at the back, too narrow at the front, too clean-edged for a boot, too symmetrical for a natural fall of snow. The closer I looked, the less human it seemed. But the height of the impression, if someone had stood there, if someone had leaned forward, if someone had stared into the window during the night, they would have been eye level with me as I slept. My fingers tightened around the shovel handle, a tight, instinctive grip. I straightened slowly and looked back to the ridge, half expecting no, half knowing that the figure would be there again, watching, waiting for me to notice. But the ridge remained empty, perfectly, impossibly empty. The mountain air felt heavier then, as if the silence had thickened. The cold deepened, chilling the space between my layers of clothing. My breath seemed too loud. My heartbeat seemed too fast. And yet the world around me remained still, unchanged, indifferent to the growing tightness in my chest. I retreated inside the tower sooner than I'd meant to, shutting the door behind me with a firmness that felt closer to fear than logic. The heater hissed warmly, but I couldn't shake the cold running beneath my skin. By noon, the sky had turned a pale, brittle blue. Visibility was nearly perfect. But for the rest of the day, every time I glanced across the valley, I expected to see that silhouette standing there again, this time closer, or darker, or somehow clearer than before. It didn't appear. What appeared instead came just after sunset, when the last of the orange light slipped behind the ridge and the world dropped into blue twilight. A flash, a brief, sharp glint like sunlight reflecting off metal right at the spot where the silhouette had stood. Only this time, there was no sun, no light source, no reason for a reflection, just a glint, as if something on that ridge had moved, just enough to catch the dying light, just enough to let me know the absence had been an illusion, just enough to remind me I was not alone up here. Night in the mountains comes on like a slow exhale, the kind that empties more than just the sky. By the time the last streaks of dusk drained from the horizon, the world outside the lookout had become a clean, depthless blue snow, reflecting what little light remained, darkness settling in layers over the forest like some careful, deliberate craft. I had always loved that hour. Blue hour. The hush before true night. But on that evening, the third full night into my rotation, it felt like standing in the momentary pause between two heartbeats, too long, too noticeable, too aware of itself. A thin band of frost crept across the inside of the western window as the temperature dropped. I brushed a sleeve across the glass to clear it, expecting to see only the shadowed ridgeline and the soft drift of snow carried low by the wind. Instead, the first thing I saw was that same glint again, a pinpoint reflection, sharp, intentional, like someone signaling. My pulse jumped, a subtle but undeniable jolt that ran through me before I could rationalize what I was seeing. I leaned closer to the window, trying to find the source. There was nothing metallic on that ridge. I knew that terrain better than most people know their own backyard. I knew where the old weather station had once stood. I knew where the fire scars still showed black through the pines. I knew the curve of the land, the cracks in the rock, the pattern of deadfall. But that glint, that flash, came from a place where nothing should reflect light, not unless something was standing there again. I turned off the lantern inside instinctively. The tower fell into semi-darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the heater. With less interior reflection on the windows, the outside world sharpened, clarified, and that's when I saw it. Not a full silhouette, not the clean, unmistakable outline of a person, but a shift like the subtle reorientation of a shape against a uniform background, a vertical line that hadn't been there earlier, a slight lean. The difference in contrast along the snow-heavy ridge, something dark, something tall, something that hadn't been visible minutes ago and was now unmistakably there. I stared, unblinking, the cold air against the glass numbing the tip of my nose. My eyes strained against the low light, but the moment I focused too hard, the shape seemed to dissolve back into the ridge, blending, hiding, becoming part of the mountain again. A trick of the eye, maybe. An illusion caused by the shifting blue light. But the small, ancient part of my brain, the part not interested in scientific explanations, wasn't convinced. The ridge hadn't been empty. It had briefly been occupied. Something was out there again, and it had moved. I forced myself away from the window, my breath tight, my chest feeling too small. I checked the radio for the third time that evening, flipping through frequencies even though I knew no one would be broadcasting. The mountains were notoriously stingy with their signals, but the static felt louder that night, hungrier. Around 7:40 p.m., the first sound broke the quiet, a soft thump, not from the ridge, not from the forest, from below the tower, from the snow I had found marked that morning. I froze where I stood, every sense sharpening like the moment before an animal bolts from danger. I held still, so still that I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. The sound didn't repeat immediately. I waited for it, counting the seconds. Nothing. 10 seconds. 15. 20. just as I began to think I'd imagined it. Another thump, heavier this time, closer, more deliberate, a shifting of weight against snow, then silence. The kind of silence that isn't absence but alarm, the way the forest sometimes goes quiet right before a predator moves through it. I edged toward the eastern window, careful to keep my footsteps light. My breath fogged the glass faster than I could wipe it away, so I held it, squinting through the narrow, cleared arc. The snow around the tower was still pristine, perfectly undisturbed. But, and this is what made my stomach twist, the indentation I'd seen that morning was deeper, only slightly, barely perceptible, but deeper, as if something had placed weight there again, as if something had returned, pressed down, listened. Every instinct screamed at me to back away from the window, but I couldn't move. My feet felt fused to the floor, my body suspended between terror and the sickening need to confirm what my mind didn't want to admit. I glanced toward the ridge one more time. At first, nothing, just the unbroken sweep of snow beneath the dying sky. But then, movement, a long, slow shift behind a curtain of thin snowfall, a suggestion of upright form. No details, only motion, too smooth, too controlled, too aware. It wasn't swaying like a tree, it wasn't flickering like a heat mirage, it wasn't collapsing like unstable snowpack. It was repositioning, rotating, turning, facing the tower. The air around me felt suddenly thinner, as if the altitude had spiked. My hands went numb, my jaw locked, and yet I couldn't look away. Because for one brief, brutal second, no more than a heartbeat, I saw definition, a sharp, vertical structure. Metal? Bone? I couldn't tell. Something rigid, something wrong, something shaped enough like a person that my brain filled in the details, even though the details weren't really there. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished again into the ripple of snowfall, not disappeared, not walked away, not dissolved, hidden, covered itself, merged with the ridge, like something practiced at not being seen. By the time I stumbled backward from the window, my breath came in shallow bursts. The tower felt too small, too exposed, too close to whatever was out there. I backed into the center of the room and turned on every light, flooding the space with harsh yellow glow until the shadows retreated to the corners. But illumination didn't calm me. It made it worse, because with the lights on, the windows became mirrors, reflective, dark, impenetrable. And in every reflection, I saw the same thing, a tall, narrow outline, just beyond the glass, just behind my own reflection, just enough out of place that I couldn't tell if it was outside or if it was something over my shoulder. The heater hissed behind me, the windows sang faintly with temperature stress, the mountain swallowed its own sound again. Then came the worst realization of the night, the indentation beneath the north window, the one that hadn't existed yesterday, the one too close for comfort, lined up perfectly with my bed. Someone or something had stood there, not to look in, but to listen, to measure, to watch me sleep. And the ridge figure? It hadn't been watching from afar. It had simply been waiting for the snow to deepen, waiting for its approach to leave no tracks, waiting for the landscape to erase every sign of movement, waiting until it could stand beside the tower without being seen, waiting until it was close enough to breathe the same air I did through the thin wooden wall. And as that realization settled, cold and absolute, I felt something else, a soft, nearly inaudible vibration against the floorboards, a resonance, a hum, faint, focused, directional, coming from the ridge. Whatever stood there wasn't just watching anymore. It was calling, or signaling, or preparing for something I wasn't meant to understand. And when the vibration stopped, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt like an answer. By the fifth night, I stopped pretending to myself that what I'd seen was a trick of light or an exhausted brain misfiring from too many days of isolation. I'd done this job long enough to know the difference between seeing something strange and imagining something strange. And whatever existed on that ridge, whatever pressed its weight into the snow below the window, was neither imagined nor passive. It was patient. That was worse. Patience is a kind of intelligence. The day itself had passed in a blur. I logged the temperatures, cleared the solar panel, reheated a can of stew I barely tasted, but my attention drifted constantly toward the windows, toward the ridgeline, toward the north side of the tower where the strange indentation had deepened. Even in daylight, it had a presence, something about its shape, its unnatural symmetry, its refusal to fill back in with blown snow, as if it had weight, even when empty, as if the snow remembered pressure and refused to release it. The light faded early, as December light does, slipping away with a tired resignation before 5 in the evening. By the time the sky turned the color of old steel, I'd already turned on the lanterns inside and stacked extra wood near the heater. I told myself it was precautionary, nothing more. Temperatures were dropping, more snow forecasted, but I stacked twice what I normally would. The heater hummed louder than usual, or maybe the silence around it was thinner, easier to break. I tried to read, but every few minutes my eyes flicked back to the windows. Every time the tower shifted under the wind, I jolted. Every time the heater clicked as it cycled, I felt my pulse jump. Around 6:40 p.m. The ridge disappeared behind a thin wall of snowfall light, lazy flakes drifting in a near horizontal line. Visibility shrank to less than half a mile. The forest became a blur of white shapes, shifting under the rising wind, the kind of night when you stay inside, secure the shutters, and wait for dawn. But something didn't wait. At 7:03 p.m., it started with a vibration. Not like before, not the distant hum I'd felt during the blue hour. This was closer, sharper. A thin tremor that buzzed up through the metal frame of the tower, like a tuning fork struck at a distance but resonating too clearly to be far away. I looked to the windows. Everything was white, and moving. A fast-moving squall blew against the tower, snowflakes slanting in tight formation as the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged instantly. The vibration grew stronger. I moved toward the north window slowly, instinct fighting logic with every step. I didn't want to see anything, but not knowing was worse. Ignorance opens the door wider than any shadow can. As I approached the window, the world outside sharpened not in clarity, but in awareness. Like the air had its own focus. A shadow emerged, barely, a disruption in the falling snow, not on the ridge, not far away, directly below the tower. The indentation, the impossible, trackless indentation. It wasn't empty anymore. Something stood in it. I couldn't see a form, not fully. Just a darker vertical plane cutting through the blue-white snow and wind. Tall, thin, angled slightly, as if leaning, and the snow didn't accumulate on it. The flakes hit, then slid off in a way that didn't match fabric, metal, or bark. My lungs tightened. A cold panic braided itself up my spine in a slow, tightening pull. I reached for the radio before realizing my hand was shaking too badly to hold it steady. The plastic crackled under my grip. I forced my breathing into shallow, quiet pulls, trying not to fog the window any further. Then, movement. Not the hesitant sway of something pushed by wind. Not the collapse of an unstable shape. A purposeful shift. A step. Silent, slow, deliberate, toward the base of the tower. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought it might shake the window itself. The figure, if it could even be called that, moved with an unnatural smoothness, a glide instead of a step. The snow beneath it compressed without a footprint forming, like pressure without contact. It stopped, right beneath the north window, directly beneath where I stood. I backed away instinctively. The tower made a faint noise, a sound I'd never heard in all my years up here, as if something were pressing lightly against the metal supports, testing them. I stood in the dim lantern glow, frozen in the middle of the room, listening. There were no footsteps, no scraping, no climbing, but something shifted its weight, and the tower answered with a soft, strained creak, the kind that only happens when a structure adjusts to external pressure. Something was touching it. Then came the sound that truly froze my blood, a low, faint inhale, not human, not animal, a pull of air that seemed to come from all directions at once, funneling toward a single point just beneath the floorboards, a sound like the world itself being inhaled through a narrow gap. The lantern flickered, my breath caught. I didn't want to look at the windows. I didn't want to see anything behind the glass. but terror has a way of steering your head even when your body begs you to look away. I turned, and a shape passed the southernmost window, not fully visible, not defined, just a moving absence, a displacement of the storm glow. It circled. It was circling the tower. I stumbled backward, knocking over my mug, spilling lukewarm coffee across the floor. The steam rose in delicate tendrils before vanishing, replaced by a creeping cold that seeped up through the floor. The shape passed another window, then another, slow, measured, mapping the interior, following my movement, tracking me through the thin wooden walls as if they weren't walls at all. I grabbed the lantern, clutching it like a shield. The light wavered but held. The tower creaked again, this time on the east side, then the south, then the west. A steady pattern, a perimeter. It was completing a circle. Every cell in my body screamed at me to run, though there was nowhere to run to. The storm outside would kill me within hours. Whatever circled the tower would kill me sooner. And then the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The sudden absence hit me harder than the presence had. I waited. Seconds stretched into long, taut strands. The silence pressed against my ears. Then, from directly above me, from the roof of the tower, came a sound so soft it barely deserved the name. Tap. A pause. Tap. Measured. Singular. Intelligent. As if something was walking along the roofline, testing the structure from above now, searching for an entrance. My throat tightened, because the only door to the tower, the only weakness, faced the ladder beneath the overhang, exactly where the shape now moved. I stepped backward until my shoulders hit the far wall. My heartbeat felt too large for my chest, and then, as if to confirm the terror I hadn't yet dared to name, a faint, nearly inaudible sound slipped down through the vent above the heater. Not words, not breath, not anything I could humanly categorize, but the direction of it, the cadence, the unnatural rhythm, made my blood go cold. It wasn't looking for a way in. It had found one. And the worst part? It was trying to speak. The sound that slipped through the heater vent that night did not begin as a voice, nor even as something resembling human breath, but rather as a thin, stretched vibration that seemed to drag itself along the inside of the metal ductwork with a kind of fragile insistence, like a frequency that had forgotten what it was supposed to be and was only now attempting to recall its original shape. It rose slowly, almost reluctantly, with a high, quivering edge that carried the faintest suggestion of intention behind it, as though something outside the tower were testing the boundaries of noise itself, feeling for the edges of comprehension, the way a blind hand traces the outline of a door. I stood in the dim golden wash of the lantern, the room around me shrinking to a tight, breathless bubble as I listened, and for a moment I had the unsettling impression that not only I, but the entire mountain, had paused to hear whatever was gathering itself in the vent. When the tone thickened, condensing into something more structured, it came as a slow compression of static and cold air pushed through too narrow a channel, like a mouth that did not yet understand its own mechanics was attempting its first approximation of speech. The sound elongated into a coarse attempt at a syllable, not quite formed, not quite formless either, hovering in the thin layer of heated air above the vent with a tremor that made the hair along my arms lift. It was the kind of noise that suggested not simply presence, but study and attempt by something unfamiliar with language to shape itself into the idea of language. The first time it managed a sound that carried the faint contour of a vowel, an ah, that wavered like a needle struggling to find the right groove. I felt an immediate, involuntary, step backward pull through my body, the lantern's light jolting with my movement, stretching tall, warped shadows across the ceiling. Shadows that seemed to warp and lean as if reacting to a presence pressing down against the roof above me. I had lived through enough winters in the tower to recognize the difference between natural and unnatural noises, between the groan of the old beams under temperature stress and something applying weight from outside. And as the strange half-formed syllable shifted again, dropping into a deeper register like it had located a more efficient resonance, everything inside the lookout, the lantern, the windows, even the heater reacted with a simultaneous, subtle shudder. The next attempt at sound came more deliberately, dragging itself through the vent with a kind of slow confidence, as though the thing producing it had realized that it could. The resulting noise, did not sound like communication so much as rehearsal, the early rehearsal of something that had been watching me speak, listening to me breathe, learning the texture of my fear and trying to translate it. Before I could convince myself that the sound was mechanical or accidental, something touched the north wall of the tower so softly that the initial thud barely registered, but with a depth and position that made my blood turn cold. It was not the thump of an animal, not the slide of snow, not the impact of falling ice. It was the faint, unmistakable pressure of something tall pressing the full length of its narrow form against the exterior siding, almost as if it were aligning itself with the window through which it had watched me sleep. A second sound followed, a slow dragging that moved along the wooden planks in a single, unbroken motion, carrying with it an impression of heightened deliberation, as if the tower were being examined by something that had no need to knock, because it already knew precisely where I stood inside. The moment I reached the northern window, a thin smear of frost spread across the glass, not from the cold inside, but from direct contact outside. A long, tapered mark etched itself in the frost, a print too clean to be condensation, too deliberate to be natural, yet too alien in proportions to belong to any limb I could imagine. It reminded me of the indentation in the snow below the tower, the one that had no tracks leading to or from it, the one that had deepened on its own. The shape on the window was the vertical echo of that same impossible form. I grabbed the radio out of instinct, but my hand shook so violently that the first few attempts at pressing the transmit button missed entirely. When I finally managed to send a call, my voice rushed out in a frantic spill of half-formed words, but the only response that came back was static, thick, choking static that felt less like broken communication and more like something was deliberately pressing itself into the channel, muffling the signal beneath a weight that did not want it to reach anyone. It was then, in that choking wash of noise, that a new and hideous thought occurred to me. The thing outside was not simply interfering with the signal, it was listening to it. The dragging outside stopped. Silence swelled against the walls in a slow, predatory crawl. My breath grew tight in my chest, and then the resonance, that terrible, half-formed voice, returned. But this time it was not confined to the vent. It came from the vent, yes, but also from the window, as if the cold glass itself were vibrating with the sound, shaping it, refining it, practicing it. The two tones wove together, the low one a slick ribbon of vibrating air and the high one a faint, eager mimicry, until they braided into something horribly coherent. And in that double, distorted harmony, a question emerged painfully clear, unspeakably wrong. Why? You... Look, the words, if they could be called that, did not carry curiosity. They carried recognition. They carried accusation. They carried the terrible awareness that I had been seen seeing it, and that this was the first step in something I did not want to understand. As if the words had been a signal, the roof above me bent under a shifting weight, the wood groaning with the pressure of something moving slowly across the planks. It was not the walk of a man. It had no rhythm, no footfall. It was weight distributed in a way no animal in these mountains could manage, like a long beam of force sliding from joist to joist with the patience of something mapping the structure plank by plank. The trapdoor hatch above me, sealed for years and warped by cold, gave a single, distinct click as its latch was tested. Not opened, tested. The dust that rained down from the seams told me the truth before I could deny it. Whatever was up there was learning the ways human structures open. The second question came then, this time shaped with a sickening precision, the echo refined, the mimicry refined, the cadence stolen directly from my own fear, as though it had been listening to the rhythm of my breathing. Why, you look? Only it wasn't a question anymore. It sounded like a memory. My memory. Spoken in a voice that belonged nowhere in nature. Everything in that moment, my breath, my heartbeat. The lantern flame hung suspended in a single fragile thread. And then the thread snapped. The weight on the roof lifted in a rapid, gliding withdrawal. the boards flexing upward as though released from tension. A cold pressure eased from the walls. The smear of frost on the window thinned, then retreated, dissolving in an unnatural reverse of condensation. The static on the radio flickered and cut out, leaving behind a stillness so absolute that it felt like something had pressed its ear against the world and then, satisfied, stepped back. But it wasn't gone. Things like that do not leave. They settle. They wait. They watch differently once they know they are being watched. When the relief crew arrived several days later and climbed the steps up to the tower, one of them paused beneath the north window, his boot sinking into a depression in the snow that should not have survived the wind, the cold, or the passing days. He crouched down, brushed his glove across it, and called up to me with an uncertain laugh, asking if I had dropped equipment or a crate or anything that could explain such a deep, precise shape. I stepped outside, and what I saw was unmistakable. The indentation had grown deeper, wider, sharpened by a weight that had returned to it again and again. Not a footprint, not a drag mark, not a collapse, a waiting place. And as I walked down the ridge toward home, feeling the thin winter sun on the back of my neck, I knew with a quiet, terrible certainty that whatever stood across from my tower had not simply been watching me. It had been learning from me. And now, somewhere across that valley, hidden in the flawless white, a tall, narrow silhouette stood in perfect stillness, shaping itself more clearly every time it sensed the direction of my gaze, waiting for the moment I looked again so it could finish becoming the thing my mind had already taught it to be. Because I had looked, and once you truly see something like that, it never stops seeing you back. Story 2. There is a particular quiet that clings to the Appalachian woods in December, a quiet that does not feel like absence so much as a presence in its own right. Snow, when it comes this early in the mountains, does not fall gently the way it does in flatter country. It comes in slow, heavy curtains that swallow sound and fold the valleys into muted chambers of gray and blue, where even your own breath seems hesitant to rise above a whisper. When I arrived at the cabin, a narrow A-frame tucked into the slope of a ridge overlooking a stand of skeletal hardwoods, I felt that hush settle around me the moment I stepped out of the truck, like the forest was drawing a long breath and waiting to see what I would do. The cabin had been advertised as a hunter's retreat, the kind of rustic rental used by people who wanted an uncomplicated place to stay during deer season, with nothing more modern than a gas heater, a tin roof, and a rough front porch that sagged under its own age. It stood in a clearing carved into the hillside, porch lights glowing with the weak orange haze of old bulbs, chimney coughing a slow ribbon of smoke into the pale evening air. I remember thinking how strangely tall the trees around it looked despite having lost their leaves, each branch reaching upward like thin, dark fingers against the heavy winter sky. By the time I carried my gear inside rifle case, duffel, the cooler I'd packed with enough food for 3 days, the temperature had dropped low enough that my breath drifted in white clouds through the doorway. The moment I closed the cabin door behind me, the familiar smell of old pine, cooled ashes, and faint mildew from damp seasons past wrapped itself around me, comforting in its own rough, unrefined way. I switched on the overhead light, a single bulb hanging from a low beam, and listened as the heater coughed twice before humming its way into a steady, uneven cycle. The place wasn't fancy, but it had what I needed: warmth, shelter, and enough quiet to make a city man feel the edges of the world again. For the first 2 hours, the cabin behaved exactly the way old cabins do. The roof pinged and clicked as it adjusted to the temperature shift. The walls expanded with the heat. The wood stove breathed out a soft, rhythmic groan each time the draft shifted. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, letting the silence wrap around me while the shadows lengthened across the floorboards. There was something soothing about being surrounded by old wood, old air, and old stingy light, something grounding in a way that only solitude can offer. It was only after the fire had settled into a steady burn, and I'd finally sat down in the single armchair near the window, that I heard the first echo. It came softly at first, a faint, muffled thump that followed the sound of me shifting in the chair. I leaned forward, adjusting my boots on the floorboards, and a second thump followed a moment later, just delayed enough to feel out of sync, like the cabin hadn't realized I'd already moved. At first, I assumed it was the heater struggling with the cold, the ducts rattling, or maybe even a loose floorboard somewhere behind the wall. Old structures all have their quirks. But then I called out a casual, "Hello?" into the empty room, just to break the quiet, just to hear something in that deep December stillness. 7 seconds later, from somewhere inside the wall behind me, came an answering sound. Not an echo, not quite, more like the memory of my voice, muffled, low, warped by the grain of the wood, but undeniably shaped like the word hello, as though the cabin had swallowed the sound whole and needed those 7 seconds to realize it should offer it back. I turned around in the chair, staring at the wall like it might be hollow enough to store my own voice inside it. The heater hummed, the fire cracked, my heart gave a single, heavy beat that echoed loudly in my chest. I told myself it was just acoustics. Old boards sometimes hold sound in strange ways. Maybe the roof beam had bounced it back late. Maybe the wood stove had carried it. But moments later, when I exhaled a long breath through my nose, the faint sound of that same breath came drifting from the opposite wall, delayed, stretched, almost thoughtful in its mimicry. 7 seconds again, the exact same gap. I tested it with a tap on the armrest, a slow, deliberate knock. The cabin returned the knock 7 seconds later. Same strength, same rhythm, same hesitation, as though it had been paying close attention. The longer I sat there, the more the sounds of my own movements began to return to me. Every shift of my boot created a soft creak that came back a moment later. Every rustle of fabric made the walls respond. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was almost polite in the way it mirrored me, as if the cabin were trying to make conversation but hadn't yet learned the timing. Only when I spoke my own name aloud, half as a joke, half as a challenge, did something change in the pattern. Ethan. My voice left my mouth. Warm and human and familiar. 7 seconds passed. Then the cabin answered. Not with the warped memory of my voice. Not with a perfect echo either. But with something that sounded like my name being repeated by a stranger who had heard it once and was trying, earnestly, to get it right. The shape of the word was correct, but the tone carried a tremor, a weird strain in the inflection, as if the speaker's mouth were not shaped like mine, and the attempt costed something to form. Then, if you could do. The sound drifted softly from the far wall, low and wrong and unmistakably directed at me, and for the first time since arriving, the quiet in the cabin stopped feeling natural. It stopped feeling safe. It began to feel like something was awake in the walls, something that had been listening for much longer than I had been speaking, something that now knew my name and wanted to hear more. The night settled in slowly, thickening around the cabin like a second set of walls, and with every hour that passed, the strange delay in the silence seemed to sharpen, as though the structure itself were becoming more attentive, more attuned to me. Outside, the snow had begun again, not heavy, but steady, a faint, whispering drift that tapped against the window in soft, irregular rhythms. Every so often the wind would push a long exhale through the trees, and the bare branches would sway with a deep, slow moan that reminded me of ship timbers shifting at sea. Yet even the sounds of the forest seemed to hesitate before reaching the cabin, as if the air around the clearing had thickened into something that filtered noise the way cloth strains water. Inside, I sat in the old armchair near the cabin's rear wall, the one closest to where my own name had been repeated back to me, and listened with a careful, unwilling attention for the next sign that the walls were still paying attention. I could feel the fire's heat on my legs and the cool draft along my shoulders, the odd imbalance in temperature that always seems to exist in buildings this old. But beneath that warmth and cold was another sensation, subtler and far less welcome, a faint, vibrating awareness, like the boards surrounding me had the quiet tension of something holding its breath. I tried to rationalize everything I had heard earlier. Acoustic traps, temperature shifts, a kind of natural reverb created by the A-frame architecture, but none of those explanations held up once I began testing the cabin deliberately. I knocked again on the armrest, softly, carefully, like a scientist isolating a variable. 7 seconds passed, and the wall behind me answered with the same knock, same pace, same pressure, only this time the tone was smoother, as if the wood had become more familiar with the mechanics of the sound. I whispered hello. A second time. 7 seconds. The reply came, clearer now, more certain of its shape. Then I tried something I had not tried before. I stood up. The cabin stood up too. It happened in the creak of a floorboard. I took a slow step toward the kitchenette, and exactly 7 seconds later, in the wall behind me, a second creak sounded the same pitch, the same weight, as though the cabin were tracking my movements by replaying their echoes through the opposite side of the room. A cold pressure collected at the base of my spine, the sort of instinctive dread you feel when someone walks behind you in an empty hallway. I turned, scanning the interior, the narrow table, the peaked ceiling, the dark corners under the loft where shadows lived in gentle sloping heaps. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, but when I took another step, the wall in front of me responded exactly the way the rear wall had moments earlier, as though something unseen was pacing opposite me, matching me stride for stride with the 7-second offset, following in a pattern I had not invited. The fire cracked twice, a sharp, splitting pop that momentarily broke the steady rhythm of the returning sounds, and for a few seconds everything was still. I stood near the center of the cabin, listening to the faint hiss of melting snow dripping off the roof, and I tried to think of anything that would explain why the acoustics were so precise, why the delay was so exact, why no matter where I stood, the answer always came from the place furthest from me. But the cabin offered its own answer before I could think of one. A sound rose from the wall again. Not a copy of my movement this time, but something that did not belong to my side of the room at all. A slow, soft shift, like someone settling deeper into a wooden seat. I felt the air near my shoulder tighten, as though the room were drawing closer, and then, from directly behind me, came the faintest impression of breath, too quiet to be heard but strong enough to be sensed, the way you sometimes know someone has entered a room without seeing them. I turned sharply. The wall behind me stood innocent and smooth, the old pine slats running in uneven vertical lines, their knots catching the lantern light like dark, unblinking eyes. Yet the pressure of being watched was unmistakable. It lingered the way a presence lingers behind a closed door, quiet but undeniable. To test it, I said my name again firmly, clearly, trying to sound unafraid. Ethan. The silence swallowed the word. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 7. And then, from inside the wall, the reply came. Not the clumsy mimicry I had heard earlier, not the dragging attempt at a vowel, but something disturbingly precise, a near-perfect reproduction of my voice, but slightly heavier, as though someone else were wearing the shape of my speech without fully fitting into it. Ethan. Hearing my own name in that tone unsettled me enough that I stepped back toward the door, the fire's warmth pulling at my jacket as if it didn't want me to move. I could feel the cabin shifting its weight around me again, the delayed echoes returning like gentle knockings from another room, and I realized with the slow, dawning unease that whatever was learning my voice was also learning my breath, the rhythm of my steps, the cadence of my silence. It repeated my name again, this time faster. 6 seconds, not 7, then 5, and then 4, as though the gap between us was closing, as though the cabin had grown impatient. A faint tremble ran through the floorboards near my boots, like the pulse of a second heartbeat where no living creature stood. I wondered then, not for the first time, how long this place had been alone before I arrived. How many winters had passed with no one to speak into the walls, how many echoes had been stored and forgotten, until someone new came along to stir them awake. And as I stood there, frozen in the wavering lantern light, the cabin whispered one more sound, soft enough to feel more than hear, shaping itself gently around the wood grain. Say it again. The voice wasn't mine anymore. It had learned enough to want more. The shift from imitation to intention happened so gradually, so quietly, that I didn't realize what had changed until I felt it. Felt it the way you feel, temperature drop or pressure rise, not with your ears, but with the ancient part of your mind that recognizes danger before logic can catch up. The cabin no longer echoed me with mechanical precision. It no longer answered only after the 7-second delay. Instead, it began to anticipate me, to fill in the space between my sounds with its own subtle adjustments, as if the hollow in the walls had learned enough to stop repeating and start responding. Outside, the snowfall thickened into a white veil that obscured the line between night and earth, and the wind settled into a long, unbroken drone high along the ridge. The forest fell into that unnerving stillness particular to deep winter nights when nothing dares move, and the trees themselves seemed to brace against some invisible pressure. But the quiet inside the cabin, that was something else entirely. It wasn't empty. It felt layered, as if the walls were swollen with memory and waiting for the next vibration to set them in motion. I took a slow breath and let it out through parted lips. A faint whisper, my whisper returned almost immediately from the opposite wall. Not 7 seconds later, but 3. Then 2. Then nearly at the same time, like the cabin was breathing with me, sinking itself to my lungs, my rhythm, my internal pace. That was when I decided to check the walls directly. I moved along the left side of the room, pressing my fingers lightly against the old pine slats. They were cold, almost unnaturally cold, as though the winter air was inside them, not outside. I followed the grain with my palm, tracing the knots, the uneven textures, the gaps where decades of expansion and contraction had pried the board slightly apart. Every place my hand paused, a soft pressure answered from inside the wood, like something shifting fractionally closer to the surface, aligning itself with where I stood. I pulled my hand away. Instantly, the pressure subsided. I tried again farther down the wall, another spot, another tentative press. Again, something inside responded, not with movement this time, but with a very subtle, almost delicate resonance, as though a thin cavity deep behind the boards was adjusting itself, echoing not just what I touched, but where I touched. I swallowed hard. There was space inside these walls, not the thin space of typical construction, a deeper space like someone had built a void where insulation should have been, and something was in that void, listening, mirroring, learning. I stepped back, the wooden floor protesting with the long, low creak, and even that sound was mirrored a moment later. Not from the same board, but from one parallel to it. Another careful mimicry, like the cabin was tracing a map of my movements through its structure. But when I moved toward the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom, the echo didn't come from a mirrored floorboard. It came from the wall ahead of me, almost a pre-echo, a soft rustle in the wood before my boot even touched the ground. The cabin wasn't mimicking anymore. It was following. I didn't want to step closer. My body leaned back before my mind formed the thought. But curiosity, or something more primal, a need to understand the mechanism of my own fear, pulled me forward. The bedroom door was half open, the darkness inside thick and heavy, the smell of cold linens drifting outward like the quiet breath of a sleeping animal. I pushed the door gently, the hinge murmuring a thin metallic complaint. The sound traveled through the room, into the hall, and then dissolved into the stillness. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the hinge sound returned, not as a copy, but as a longer, lower groan, stretching out the way a person might stretch a word they don't quite know how to pronounce. I flicked on the bedroom light. The bulb glowed weakly, fighting the cold, casting a faint amber halo across the small, sparsely furnished room. A bed, a nightstand, a small dresser, a single window with frost feathering the edges of the glass like delicate white veins. And along the far wall, near the floorboards, I saw something I had missed before, a small, rectangular panel, rough wood, unpainted, not quite flush with the wall, as if it had been moved many times, as if it had been opened recently. A crawl space, or hollow. The temperature around it felt wrong, colder than the rest of the room, with a faint metallic tang on the air that made my tongue go numb for a second. I crouched slowly, setting my hand against the floor for balance. The wood beneath my palm vibrated with a low pulsing cadence, not constant but rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat muffled inside thick layers of timber. And then, from behind the panel, inside the hollow space, something spoke, not a word this time, a murmur, a strained, unfinished attempt. Then, but the timing was wrong. It hadn't waited for me to speak. It hadn't waited for anything. It was initiating. I felt a cold thrill slip down my spine. my mouth went dry. And in that split second of realization, the understanding fell into me like a stone sinking through deep water. It didn't just want to echo my voice anymore. It wanted to use it. I backed up too quickly, my shoulder bumping the nightstand. The lamp wobbled, flickering shadows across the wall, and as I steadied myself, the cabin let out a longer, more deliberate sound, one that did not belong to any echo I had ever heard. From inside the wall, something shifted. Not just sound, mass, weight, a subtle, dragging rearrangement of space itself. And then, very softly, almost tenderly, the cabin whispered again, with a new shape in its voice. Come closer. Not my voice, not the cabin's memory of my voice. Something halfway between, as though it had begun constructing a version of me inside itself, and that version was learning to speak. By the time the cabin whispered for me to come closer, the light inside the bedroom had already dimmed into a weak, flickering amber, the kind of dying glow that makes shadows swell and bend along the edges of furniture, so that every angle feels slightly off from what your memory insists it should be. I stayed where I was, halfway between the door and the nightstand, pulse thudding in my ears with a steady, nauseating heaviness, and although the rational part of my mind shouted to leave the room, to walk back through the hall, to pull on my boots and jacket and brave the cold darkness outside rather than remain in the presence of whatever was shaping itself within the walls, my body didn't move. The atmosphere inside the room had changed subtly at first, then completely transforming from the ordinary cold of winter into something denser, as though the space itself had thickened, pressing into the air like invisible fog. It was not a temperature shift. The warmth from the lantern still radiated faintly across my hands. It was a kind of pressure, a presence that filled the hollow places between breaths. The small rectangular panel near the floor, crooked, rough-edged and swollen with moisture, seemed to pulse with that pressure, swelling forward with every soft vibration coming from behind it, not literally pushing outward, but creating the unsettling illusion that something on the other side was pushing the air out instead. As I stared at it, listening for any hint of movement, the cabin settled into a silence so delicate and refined that it felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of mine. I took a step backward, slow, measured, the floorboard beneath my boot letting out a faint creak. The sound should have dissipated into the open room, but instead it traveled inward, absorbed instantly into the wood as if swallowed, and then, after the familiar lag that no longer obeyed 7 seconds but instead a rhythm of its own choosing, the same creak issued softly from somewhere behind the panel in a tone that felt cruelly precise, less like an echo and more like a demonstration. I spoke then, barely above a whisper, though I hadn't intended to. The words slipped out of me in a nervous exhale. What do you want? The room absorbed a sentence, like water sinking into dry earth. I counted under my breath, 1, 2, 3, but when the answer came, it did not come after a predictable delay, and it did not mirror my tone. It emerged suddenly, without warning, and from more than one direction. The walls behind me murmured first, producing a stretched, dragging version of my words that felt too thin, like the ghost of a voice trying to move through a narrow throat. But before the word want fully dissolved into the quiet, a second voice rose from behind the panel, the hollow in the wall shaping the same question with a warped immediacy that made every nerve in my skin recoil. It said, "What do you want?" in a tone so close to mine that it felt like something had reached through the wood and stolen the air directly from my mouth. I stepped back again, and again the floorboard creaked beneath me. This time the echo returned instantly, not waiting, not imitating my weight or my movement, but producing the sound as its own reply, as though the cabin were asserting that the noises belonged to it, not me. I found myself glancing toward the window, the frost patterns along its edges spiderwebbing into the corners like delicate veins, and for a brief second I thought I saw something in the reflection. A slight shift in the darkness behind me, a motion that belonged to no identifiable shape. When I looked directly, nothing was there, but the air had moved. I felt it against the back of my neck. Trying to anchor myself, I reached slowly toward the lantern on the nightstand, not to turn it off, but to steady its light, as if a brighter glow might dislodge the tension that knotted the room. My fingers brushed the metal handle, and the instant that tiny sound rang against the metal, a faint metallic click, the entire cabin answered. A dozen small noises rose at once, soft but distinct. The creak of a floorboard from the hall, the whisper of a shift in the kitchen wall, the groan of the ceiling beam above the living room, all of them delayed by milliseconds, each one shaped like the click I had just made. Each one played back at me from a different part of the structure. It was as if the cabin had not only learned my voice, but learned every noise I was capable of producing, every brush of fabric, every shift of weight, every breath, and it was now dispersing those sounds through its bones like an animal flexing its muscles. My heart pounded, loud enough that I wondered whether the cabin could hear it too, whether it could reach for the sound of my fear the way it reached for my voice. I backed toward the hallway door, 1 step, 2, careful not to turn my back entirely on the panel, but every step seemed to provoke the walls into movement. A soft hiss rose behind me, the sound of the hallway floor shifting, and then something else happened. Something subtle but unmistakable. The whispering cadence from behind the panel shifted from imitation to something closer to conversation. It said something new. Inside, the word was stretched, contorted by the grain of the wood, but it was unmistakable. I froze. The air pressed against my chest like a closed fist. I whispered before I could stop myself. Inside what? The answer came immediately, too immediately. Inside. You. My blood went cold. My throat tightened. Not because the words themselves were terrifying, though they were, but because the voice that spoke them did not sound like me anymore. It sounded like a voice built out of the pieces of mine, rearranged into a version that no longer needed me to finish learning. A version with its own cadence, its own pacing, its own hunger for structure. I stepped through the bedroom doorway, barely daring to breathe. But before I could cross fully into the hall, a deeper resonance rolled through the cabin, slow, continuous, like something large shifting inside the walls, something that had been compressed for far too long and was now expanding in deliberate, quiet stretches. The boards around me trembled, not violently, but in a way that suggested strain, as though the space inside the walls had become too small for whatever was occupying it. For one dizzying moment, I imagined the entire cabin inhaling, the hollow behind the panel pulling in air, not to echo me, but to fill itself, to grow, to reach outward. As I stood there, on the threshold between the hall and the room, the cabin spoke one final time. Not from the panel, not from the walls, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the floor, where the support beams met the frozen ground. This voice did not imitate me. It did not practice. It did not echo. It introduced itself. Let me out. The boards beneath my feet bowed inward. The lamp flickered, and the cold, which had been hovering around the edges of the room all night, surged upward as if rising from a deep buried place. Whatever lived inside the cabin walls was no longer content to observe. It wanted to step through. The moment the words "let me out" drifted upward through the floorboards, the entire cabin seemed to tighten around them, as if the structure itself had inhaled and was now holding that breath in a strained, trembling suspension. For a long stretch of seconds, nothing moved. Not the shadows, not the air, not even the faint ribbon of smoke curling from the wood stove. Everything stood in a kind of heavy paralysis, as though the building had become an organism with a single, focused attention trained on me. I could feel it in the way the floor vibrated under my boots, not in a rhythmic pattern, not like footsteps or scraping, but like the slow, deep rumble of something shifting into a new posture, something adjusting its shape within a space that had grown too confining. The hollow in the walls no longer felt like an absence. It felt like a chest expanding. I backed into the hallway with deliberate slowness, each movement small, measured, and painfully conscious, trying to remain quiet even as my pulse urged me to run. The lantern in my hand trembled just slightly, casting shuddering ribbons of amber light along the cabin's narrow corridor. Every place the light touched seemed to respond, walls bowing inward by a fraction of an inch, shadows thickening, reflections in the framed window glass, bending just enough that the angles felt subtly wrong. I tried to breathe through the rising panic, but the air in the cabin had taken on a sour, metallic quality, like the air inside an unused attic or behind a sealed basement door, heavy with things that had lingered too long without circulation. The voice, if it could still be called that, did not repeat the phrase. It did not whisper any new words. Instead, it settled into a low, continuous hum that seeped upward through the beams, resonating with the structure so completely that the floor under me felt alive. I could not tell whether the hum was coming from the walls or the ground beneath the cabin or some deep cavity between them that should not exist, but whatever was producing it was no longer imitating my sounds. It was steadily building towards something that felt less like communication and more like emergence. I reached the front room, my shoulder brushing against the rough edge of the kitchen counter, and for a moment the cabin felt eerily still again, as if sensing the change in my position. The fire flickered in the stove, throwing a soft, reddish glow across the wooden floorboards. I listened for movement behind me, expecting another creak, another delayed reply, another unnatural articulation of sound, but nothing came. The absence of the echo was worse than its presence. It meant that whatever was inside the walls no longer needed to practice. It meant that it had learned enough. Then, from the far corner of the room near the staircase leading to the small loft, a new sound rose, deeper than the earlier hum, a resonant groan that rippled through the supporting beams like tension being released from a tightened body. The staircase shuddered, dust drifting from the edges where wood met wall, and the boards beneath the first step flexed downward ever so slightly, as though something heavy had pressed against them from below. I stared at that staircase, unable to blink, unable to take even one more backward step, because as the wood bowed, a long, narrow line of separation formed between the step and the riser, revealing a sliver of the space beneath it, and from that sliver spilled the faintest breath of cold air that carried the same metallic tang I had tasted near the panel in the bedroom. The cold moved across the floor in a slow, creeping wave, gathering around my ankles like fog curling around the trunks of trees. My voice cracked when I whispered, "Stay back." It was a foolish thing to say, a human reaction to something that was not human, but fear tends to reach for whatever small illusions of control we can muster. The cabin responded not with mimicry this time, but with a sudden, sharp shift in the walls, a creaking that rolled along the perimeter like a ripple of vertebrae snapping into place. It felt like the building itself had turned its attention toward me, and the heaviness of that attention was so palpable that for a moment I could not breathe. The opening beneath the first step widened. Not much, only the width of 2 fingers, yet the cold it released surged outward, filling the lower room with a chill that did not belong to outdoor winter air. It was the cold of interior spaces, the cold of deep, enclosed hollows where things wait, the cold of places that see no sun at all. And then, from behind that small, widening gap, came a sound so soft I might have missed it if the cabin had not fallen deathly still once more. It was not a word. It was not an echo. It was a single, quiet exhale of breath drawn in by something that wanted more than sound. It wanted air, my air. I staggered backward, pulse rising into a hard, dizzying thrum in my ears, and nearly knocked over the lantern. The glass rattle echoed through the room immediately, instantly replayed not from the staircase or the walls, but from a place behind me. I whipped around, lantern lifted, only to find the far window glowing with the reflection of my own face in the dim light. But the moment I registered my own reflection, I understood what had changed. The reflection was delayed. Not long, half a second, maybe less, but delayed enough that when I blinked, the reflected version of me blinked later. The cabin was echoing my sight now, not my sound. A deep, unnatural tremor ran up the walls like a full-body shiver inside the structure. The floorboards beneath me bowed inward again. And from beneath the staircase, through the widening gap, came a low, deliberate murmur, one that carried an unmistakable finality. "Let me through." The crack in the staircase expanded in a sudden, wrenching snap, wood tearing as if pulled from the inside. I stumbled backward again, lantern swinging wildly, flame guttering in its glass chamber. The air in the room swelled, not in temperature, not in pressure, but in mass, as though something was pressing into the space from behind the walls, stretching them outward, distorting the cabin's geometry until every line of the room felt slightly slanted. In that moment, I knew with a sharp, instinctive certainty that the cabin had not been built over something. It had been built around something. Or perhaps it had grown around it. Slowly, year after year, layer after layer of timber added by hands who never knew the hollow was there or who chose not to acknowledge it, and whatever had been trapped inside, starved of shape and voice and movement, had spent every winter alone, waiting for someone to stay long enough, speak long enough, breathe long enough for it to learn the final piece it needed. Imitation, not to mimic, to replace. The boards beneath my boots flexed again, and the lantern flickered one last time before settling into an unsteady flame. I looked toward the door. It felt impossibly far. I looked toward the staircase. The gap behind the step had widened to nearly the size of a fist, and from that darkness, a shape began to press forward. Thin, colorless, and translucent, like breath given form, like sound condensed into matter. It reached the edge of the step and paused, trembling with the strain of holding itself together. Then, in a voice that matched mine with terrible precision, it whispered the words I did not want to hear. "Let me be you." I moved. I didn't think. I moved. I grabbed the lantern with both hands, swung it hard toward the stove, and sent it crashing against the cast iron. The flame inside shattered into a bright blossom that spilled across the hearth, catching instantly on the rug and the old, dry floorboards. Fire raced outward in a chaotic, hungry circle, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, the cabin's voice faltered. The hum broke. The echoes died. The thing behind the staircase pulled back with a sound like air imploding. I didn't stop to watch. I ran through the door into the freezing, snow-choked night. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. By morning, the cabin was gone. Nothing remained but blackened beams and frost-covered ash, steaming faintly in the pale December sun. But sometimes, in quiet places, parking garages, train stations, empty hallways late at night, I hear an echo follow one beat too late. And every time I hear that delayed whisper in the air, in a voice that is almost mine, but not quite, I feel my blood run cold, because when the cabin burned, something in the walls finally got out, and it has been learning ever since. Story 3. Most people don't realize how quiet a highway can become after midnight in late December, especially when the temperature drops low enough that the asphalt seems to stiffen under the cold, and the wind scrapes across the empty lanes like it's searching for something it misplaced. The toll booth where I worked that winter stood at the far end of an aging steel bridge that arched over a narrow Blackwater River, a long groaning thing built in the late 60s, with bolts that stuck like frozen knuckles and a deck that always hummed faintly when traffic passed over it. During the day, the place had the kind of noise you'd expect from commuters, delivery trucks, and the occasional tourist trying to find the right exit. But at night, especially on the week leading up to Christmas, the world contracted into a corridor of dim amber lights and distant wind, and my booth felt like the last little island of warmth in a world made of iron and ice. I always worked the overnight shift by choice. Something about that stretch of hours from midnight to 6 in the morning felt suspended, neither part of the day behind nor the day ahead, like time stepped aside to let a different kind of existence move through the world. Most people hated the quiet. I thrived in it. The booth had its own rhythms. The metallic hum of the heater in the corner, the sharp buzz of the fluorescent bulb overhead, to the scratch of my pen as I filled out the logs by hand, since our system was too old for digital updates. On good nights, the bridge only saw a handful of vehicles, maybe a semi, maybe a lone sedan, sometimes nothing at all for a full hour. That solitude was part of why the job appealed to me. After losing my father earlier that fall, after drifting through the months that followed in a fog of grief and half-formed habits, I found the thought of a job that required silence and repetition strangely comforting, like something in the soundlessness of the bridge aligned better with the person I had become. The night it started, the night everything shifted from quiet into something much more confusing and much more frightening, fell on December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas Eve. A brittle wind had been blowing all afternoon, and by the time I clocked in at 11:47 p.m., The river far below had turned into a vast, glassy expanse that reflected the last traces of moonlight with a hard, silver sheen. My supervisor had left a note on the desk reminding me that traffic would be light due to icy conditions, and I'd shrugged it off because light traffic meant long stretches of nothing, which meant time to read, time to think, time to let the night drift in its usual slow way. For the first 90 minutes, that's exactly how it went. One UPS truck rumbled past, the driver giving me the standard tired half salute. A beat-up sedan rolled through at 12 to 32 a.m., the window half frozen in the down position, the driver's gloved hand reaching out with change that clinked loudly in the tray. After that, silence, the kind of silence where even your breathing starts to sound like an intrusion. The heater hummed in lazy pulses, and I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes wander between the empty road, the river below, and the dim squares of the log sheet. The night felt long but uneventful, predictable in the way all nights on the bridge tend to be. Then, at exactly 1:14 a.m., I saw the headlights. A pair of old halogen beams cut through the darkness at the far end of the bridge, softened by the low fog that clung to the river. The silhouette of the vehicle was familiar, a boxy, older model pickup, two-door, with a greenish tint in the metal that came through even under the harsh overhead lighting. Something about it felt ordinary at first. There are 1,000 trucks like that scattered across the state, but as it rolled closer, I began to notice little details that didn't quite fit the picture. The truck moved with a subtle lurch, not the kind caused by engine trouble, but the kind that comes from uneven weight distribution, as though something heavy had been placed in the back without being tied down. The wheels left faint arcs of melting frost on the asphalt, tracing patterns that shimmered in the orange glow of the lamps overhead. The driver sat stiffly, hands at 10 and 2, face barely visible behind fogged glass. As the truck rolled to a stop at my booth, the old metal rumbled like it was waking from a long sleep. The driver didn't look at me when I leaned forward. He didn't look anywhere. His eyes, barely visible beneath the shadow of the windshield, stared at a point far ahead on the bridge, unfocused and glassy, like he was watching a movie projected on the darkness. His breath didn't fog the inside of the cold glass. His fingers didn't move. He simply existed within the frame of the truck like a figure in a photograph that someone had forgotten to animate. I reached out, tap, 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 against the window of the booth, not loud, not intrusive, because sometimes nighttime drivers were simply exhausted, but the man didn't react. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He didn't even seem to hear the sound. The toll light above my booth clicked from red to green, triggered either by some tiny motion or by the weight sensor failing to catch the delay. The gate lifted with a groan, and the truck eased forward, not abruptly, not dangerously, but with an eerie smoothness, as if it had memorized the motion of crossing. I watched it travel across the next 50 feet of road, the taillights glowing a sickly red, before it faded into the mist that swallowed the far end of the bridge. I told myself it wasn't unusual. Exhausted drivers act strangely all the time. People travel late for a dozen reasons. Maybe he was numb with cold or deep in thought or trying to stay awake, but the feeling that stretched through my chest was not one of ordinary unease. It was quiet and deep and cold, like the beginnings of a bruise forming beneath the skin of my mind. I sat back down, then tried to return to my log. I wrote the time, 1:14 a.m., pickup truck, older model, green, driver unresponsive. But when I glanced at the corner of the toll booth screen that counted the number of vehicles that passed through per shift, the number glowed a soft, unassuming green. 0. The system hadn't registered the truck at all. Not the weight, not the gate trigger, not the passage, nothing. As if the truck had glided through the booth without ever having existed. I stared at the number for several long, breathless seconds, waiting for the counter to flicker, waiting for the system to refresh, waiting for something, anything, to correct itself and acknowledge what I had just seen. But it didn't. The number stayed at 0 with unwavering certainty. The wind rattled softly along the metal frame of the booth. A faint hum rose from the bridge, that familiar metallic vibration I had known for years. Yet this time the sound felt different, almost like it carried a memory of something that had passed through long before the night I sat there. And as I stared through the fog at the now empty stretch of road, my pen still hovering above the log sheet, I felt a sudden, heavy certainty settle into my stomach. Whatever had just crossed that bridge had not been traveling for the first time. It had been completing a cycle, one it wasn't finished with. Not yet. The fog coming off the river thickened over the next half hour, turning the world beyond the booth into a shifting watercolor of muted oranges and grays, shapes dissolving the moment you tried to understand them. I kept glancing at the sensor screen, half expecting the counter to correct itself, but the number remained stubbornly fixed at 0. 0 vehicles passed, 0 weight registered, 0 contact with anything at all. The truck might as well have been a hallucination if not for the way its headlights had carved 2 unmistakably real beams through the fog, catching the metal railings, catching the frost on the asphalt, catching the faint ripple of vapor coming off the river. Hallucinations didn't leave light behind. Hallucinations didn't rattle old steel grates as they crossed. To distract myself from the strange knot in my stomach, I stepped outside the booth for a few moments, just enough to breathe in the harsh cold and clear my head. The air smelled of wet iron and frozen water, the scent of the river rising in faint mineral threads. I listened for normal things, the wind scraping against the bridge supports, the distant groan of ice shifting under the surface, the gentle rattle of loose bolts overhead. The familiar noises helped until they didn't, until something felt off in the rhythm of it all. The wind wasn't consistent. Usually it rose and fell in long, sweeping gusts, but tonight it moved in short, choppy bursts, as though it were circling the bridge rather than moving across it. I stepped back inside, closing the booth door behind me with a dull, comforting thud. The heater kicked on in a series of uneven clicks, and the fluorescent bulb flickered just enough to remind me it was older than most of the equipment I worked with. I forced myself to fill in the next couple of lines on the shift log and tried to return to the monotony of the job. But the moment I looked back toward the roadway, I knew monotony was no longer on the schedule. At exactly 1:59 a.m., 45 minutes after the first sighting, the truck appeared again. Same headlights, same slow lurch, same hazy green paint catching the toll lights in uneven patches. The silhouette emerging from the fog was identical to the one I had watched earlier, down to the subtle dip in the front bumper and the slight lean of the cab. I felt a pressure in my throat, a quiet, involuntary swallow, because even before it reached the booth, before I could see the driver, before the engine's rattle found its way to my ears, I already knew what I was about to see. The exact same truck, moving at the exact same speed, heading toward my booth in the exact same silence. I leaned forward, my breath condensing against the glass. As the truck pulled closer, I saw him again, the driver, stiff, still, unblinking. His eyes, if you could call them that through the hood of fog pressed against the windshield, were fixed ahead in that same distant way, as though he were staring not at the road but through it, at some point that neither belonged to the bridge nor to the night. This time I was certain he wasn't seeing anything at all. His posture was too rigid, his hands on the wheel too motionless. It was the posture of a posed figure, not a living man. The truck rolled to a stop in front of my booth, and for a moment I held on to the irrational hope that he might turn his head, blink, acknowledge me with a nod or a jerk of the chin or even the barest flicker of recognition. Anything. But he didn't move, not even to breathe. I watched the glass near his lips, waiting for the faintest cloud of condensation, but the inside of the windshield remained as dry and still as stone. The toll light clicked green. The gate lifted. The truck drifted forward, and again, when I checked the sensor screen, the counter remained steady at 0. It hadn't registered him. Not once, not twice, not at all. I sat down slowly, trying to piece together the possible explanations. Faulty sensors, a malfunctioning weight plate, a glitch in the aging toll computer, but each explanation felt thin, hollow, unwilling to hold its own weight. None of the equipment upstream of my booth had malfunctioned earlier in the night. And if the system had simply failed, the gate wouldn't have triggered automatically. The truck had been granted passage by something internal, something automated, something that believed it had read a legitimate signal, but the system insisted nothing had crossed. I made a note in the logbook, my handwriting growing smaller and tighter as though trying to hide itself on the page. 1:59 a.m. Same truck, same driver, behavior unchanged. no system record. The moment I put down the pen, a faint vibration rolled through the metal flooring of the booth, not strong, not jarring, but distinct, a slow wave of pressure that seemed to follow the truck's path as it moved deeper onto the bridge. I felt it in my ankles first, then up my legs, a soft metallic hum crawling under the soles of my boots. The bridge often trembled under semis or heavy traffic, but not under a single lightweight pickup. This vibration wasn't caused by weight. It was caused by pattern. I watched the red taillights dim and fade as the truck disappeared into the fog, swallowed by the same low mist that had consumed it the first time, leaving the bridge once again empty, still, and impossibly silent. Then the toll computer beeped, a soft notification tone, the kind it used when a vehicle had just passed. I looked at the screen. Vehicle count. 1. The system had done something new. It had logged a truck that had never been detected. Not the one at 114. Not the one at 159. A ghost count for a vehicle that wasn't here, for a crossing that hadn't happened. I stared at that number for far too long. The fluorescent bulb above me buzzing softly in the background. The wind rose again over the river, pushing a long, hollow wail through the beams of the bridge that made the booth's windows tremble in their frames. Then, at exactly 2:44 a.m., another 45 minutes later, the headlights appeared again at the far edge of the fog. Same truck, same pace, same unseeing driver. And as it approached, the vibration under my feet returned, stronger this time, pulsing like a heartbeat that did not belong to the bridge or to anything alive. A single, cold realization unfurled inside me, slow as a shadow stretching across the pavement. The bridge wasn't simply carrying the truck, it was remembering it. And the truck wasn't traveling the road, it was repeating it. A loop, a cycle, a crossing that could not end, one that was getting closer to whatever part of the pattern I occupied on this side of the toll booth. By the time the truck crossed for the third time, the night had taken on a quality I still struggle to describe, something stretched thin, like a fabric pulled taut to the point of transparency, where the space between moments began to feel fragile, insubstantial, as though one misstep might tear straight through the hours and drop me somewhere I didn't belong. The fog outside drifted in heavy ribbons over the river, but the fog inside my mind was thicker still, settling over every thought and every sense of familiarity I had with this job, this booth, this bridge. I kept glancing from the empty road to the sensor screen, from the counter to the logbook, as though one of them might suddenly correct the impossible math of the night and reassure me that all of this had been nothing more than fatigue or misinterpretation. But none of them changed. The counter was wrong every time. The logbook felt like the scribblings of someone documenting a dream. The booth, which had always felt cramped and claustrophobic during winter shifts, now felt vast in the worst possible way, as though it were being watched from every angle by the darkness beyond the glass. At 2:44 a.m., the truck repeated its approach in the same slow, deliberate glide, its headlights cutting the fog in the same pale arcs, its engine rumbling with the same tired stutter that never quite sounded mechanical. But the third time was different in one subtle, essential way. The driver's head tilted. Not much. Not enough for me to see his face clearly, but enough that the motion registered as intentional, as though he had become aware of me, or of the expectation within the loop, or of the growing friction between repetition and deviation. His chin dipped the slightest degree toward his shoulder, an unnatural angle, stiff but purposeful, like someone who had been motionless for a very long time was being nudged into remembering movement. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the fog, a play of shadow, the illusion of motion caused by the truck's rumbling. But that lie collapsed under the weight of the second detail that followed. When the toll gate lifted and the truck rolled past the booth, the vibration beneath my feet did not simply mirror the earlier crossings. It strengthened, the pulse rolling through the steel plates, like something was following closely behind the truck, or within it, or beneath it, as though the bridge were reacting not to the passing of a vehicle, but to the reappearance of a memory it had been forced to carry for too long. I tried to focus on the facts, on the physicality of the moment, the frost on the windshield, the exact angle of the headlights, the recognizable dent in the bumper, the cadence of the engine, any variable that might shift or break the illusion. But nothing shifted. Nothing broke. Everything was exact. And that exactness was the most terrifying thing of all. When the truck disappeared into the fog for the third time, I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, slow and deep, grounding myself in the hum of the heater and the faint rattle of the fluorescent light. But my breath didn't steady. Instead, it seemed to fall out of rhythm with the world around me, as though I were breathing on a different frequency than the one my surroundings inhabited. And when I opened my eyes again, something else was wrong. The toll monitor was flickering, not fading, not glitching, flickering with pattern. The vehicle counter ticked from 0 to 1, then from 1 to 2, then from 2 to 3, and then it reset to 0 again. 0, 1, 2, 3, reset. 0, 1, 2, 3, reset. Over and over, the numbers cycled, not in response to motion or weight or external signals, but according to some internal clock that I had never known the system possessed. I watched it repeat this sequence a dozen times before I forced myself to look away, the sick feeling in my stomach swelling into something that felt eerily like a warning. Machines didn't behave this way on their own. Violations of logic like this required influence, pressure, presence, force. I checked the time again. 3:29 a.m., 45 minutes since the last crossing. The number had become a kind of dread in itself, a clock counting down to the next arrival of something that was no longer just passing through. The fog outside deepened again, swallowing the lamps nearest to the booth, until only 2 pools of orange light remained, one above me, humming faintly, and one further down the bridge, flickering as if struggling to stay lit beneath the weight of the snow-laden air. The moment the clock struck 3:44 a.m., I felt the bridge shift. Not much, not the kind of jolt you feel when a semi hits a rough patch, but a long, slow, settling motion, as though the steel beams were rearranging themselves under some unseen burden. The river below groaned with a deep, resonant strain, and before the glow of headlights even pierced the fog, I knew the truck was coming again. But this time, something else came with it. The fog at the far end of the bridge didn't part around the headlights the way it had earlier. Instead, it recoiled, pulling back in slow, uneven waves, like fabric being dragged by an unseen hand. The light that emerged was dimmer than before, still halogen, still familiar, but flickering faintly, as though the source were struggling to maintain its shape. And for the first time since the cycle began, the truck did not follow the exact path it had taken before. It drifted slightly to the left, tires kissing the center line. Not enough to signal an intentional change, but enough to disrupt the pattern, enough to suggest that something was becoming aware of its own repetition. My throat tightened as the truck crept forward, inch by inch, closer and closer to the booth. Its engine sputtered in an irregular rhythm now, like an old recording degrading with each replay. And when it finally stopped at the toll window, the driver's head turned another inch toward me, enough that I saw his face, or rather, the outline of it. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no skin, only the faint impression of a face, like a photograph exposed to too much light. Its details burned away. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply stared, cold spreading through my chest in a long, slow wave. Then the driver's head jerked sharp, unnatural, abrupt, as though some external force had snapped it into position. And for the first time that night, something inside the truck moved, slowly, deliberately. Not the driver, something else, something behind him. Its hand, or the approximation of one pressed against the fogged rear window, a shape made of lightless shadow, human in outline, wrong in every way. I stumbled backward involuntarily, my chair scraping loudly against the booth floor. The gate lifted, the truck rolled forward, and the shadow in the back seat turned as it passed me, its shape following me with a focus so cold and absolute it felt like being pinned beneath a slab of ice. By the time the truck vanished into the fog again, I could barely feel my hands. The heater hummed behind me, but none of its warmth reached my skin. And when I finally forced myself to check the toll monitor, the counter had changed again. Not 0, not 1, not a reset, Just two words glowing in the center of the display in pale green text no toll system should ever be capable of showing. It's close. By the time the message "it's close" flickered across the toll monitor, something fundamental in the booth shifted, not in the air, not in the light, but in the sense of place itself, as if the booth had been peeled loose from the ordinary world and was now held only by the memory of where it should be. The fog pressed harder against the windows, smoothing into a solid gray mass that erased the lamps on either side of the bridge. The booth might as well have been floating in a cloud with no sense of distance or orientation. I had the sudden, sickening impression that if I stepped outside, the ground might not be where I expected it, that the first step would plunge me into something deeper and colder than the river below. The heater hummed, but its warmth no longer registered. The fluorescent light above me buzzed in irregular pulses, each flicker elongating the shadows in ways that made them seem both too thin and too tall. I kept staring at the monitor, hoping that some system anomaly would sweep the message away, replace it with numbers again, anchor me back into the mundane sequence of shifts and logs and cold hours. But the pale green letters stayed exactly as they were, steady, unblinking, resting in a part of the operating system that shouldn't have had room for language at all. I whispered, "Close to what?" before I realized how naive the question was. The answer came immediately, not through the monitor, not through the booth speakers, not through any machine I could point to, but through the bridge itself. A long, low vibration rolled beneath the floor like a shudder traveling through the spine of the structure. It moved slowly, deliberately, crossing through the steel with a resonance that didn't feel mechanical. It felt emotional, like anticipation, or hunger, or grief. It stopped directly beneath me, holding there in a tense, humming pause that seemed to wait for my acknowledgement. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare. And then, from the farthest end of the bridge, barely perceptible through the density of the fog, I saw the faintest flicker of halogen light. The truck was coming again, but this time there was no 45-minute gap. This time, it was early. The light trembled, dim at first, like a dying star, then steadied into the familiar, pale beams that had preceded the truck every time before. But something about the glow felt strained, stretched thin, as if the cycle it was trapped in had begun to decay. The fog didn't part around it the way it had earlier. Instead, it seemed to cling to the light, distorting it, pulling at it, dragging it through the air with a kind of sluggish reluctance that made the headlights appear warped, elongated, almost serpentine. I leaned forward, body stiff with dread, and the hum beneath the booth floor deepened, vibrating through the metal panels so intensely that the bolts in the wall rattled in place. The booth windows trembled. A hairline crack formed in the upper corner of the left pane, growing a fraction of an inch every second, like frost spreading across ice. The headlights grew brighter, then brighter still, then far too bright. They didn't just illuminate the fog, they saturated it, turning the entire span of the bridge into a glowing tunnel of pale yellow light. For a long, breathless moment, I thought the truck was rushing toward me at an impossible speed, so fast that it blurred into streaks. But no, when I looked closer, when I squinted through the smothering glare, I saw the shape of the vehicle was not moving quickly at all. It was crawling closer with excruciating slowness. But the light was moving fast, as if the headlights had detached from the vehicle and were stretching toward the booth, searching, probing, reaching ahead of their own source. I stumbled backward as the light poured across the glass, washing over the interior of the booth with a pale, sickly radiance that made everything look two-dimensional, flattened, as though the booth had become a drawing and the world outside intended to erase it. My own shadow on the wall elongated until it reached the ceiling, then flickered, bent, and folded in on itself before snapping back into shape. The hum beneath the booth changed again, not a vibration this time, but a deep, hollow thump, like a massive heartbeat pulsing somewhere beneath the bridge deck. One pulse, then another, and then a third, each stronger than the last, and then everything stopped. The light, the hum, the wind, everything. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. And out of that impossible stillness, the truck eased forward one final length of pavement until it rested directly in front of my booth, closer than it had ever come. so near I could have reached out and touched the peeling paint on the door if not for the barrier of glass between us. The driver turned his head fully toward me this time. His face was not a blur anymore. It was an absence, a smooth, pale plane where features should have been, like a mask carved from light and fog. And yet, somehow, I could feel its gaze. It pressed into my chest like the weight of a hand. Something moved in the back seat. Not a shadow this time, not the faint suggestion of shape. Something solid, a figure unfolding itself into the space, rising slowly until its head brushed the ceiling of the cab. The window glass fogged around it. Not from warmth, but from cold so intense it crystallized the moisture instantly. Its arm, or the approximation of an arm, dragged along the inside of the window, leaving trails of frost that spiraled like the branches of ice fractals. And then the toll monitor chimed, a soft, polite beep. The display flickered, and a new message appeared. Don't move. I froze. The truck's engine sputtered once, twice, then fell silent, the headlights flickering as though struggling for breath. The figure in the back seat pressed one long hand against the window. The glass bulged outward, not cracking, not breaking, bulging, as though the material had softened into something pliable in its presence. The toll gate did not lift. The system did not engage. Nothing moved. The booth felt as though it had been sealed inside a vacuum. Then the monitor chimed again. One more message. It sees you now. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath until it escaped in a tremor that fogged the glass in front of me. The figure in the back seat lowered its hand. The frost pattern sharpened, branching outward like veins. The driver's head tilted farther, a full unnatural arc that pulled its smooth, featureless face closer to the window, closer to me, and then, without warning, both headlights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered, snapped off. The truck disappeared into darkness so complete it felt like a hole torn in the world, but I could still feel it there. Both of them, watching, waiting, learning the shape of my stillness. And somewhere deep beneath the bridge, the heartbeat pulsed once more. Slow, heavy, final. The cycle had changed. It was no longer looping. It was converging. For a long, paralyzed stretch of seconds after the headlights died, the bridge existed in a kind of absolute darkness I had never known, a hollow, depthless dark that erased the edges of the world and left only the booth, my breath, and the sense of something immense and attentive lingering just beyond the glass. The fluorescent bulb above me flickered once, weakly, casting a sickly band of white across the booth floor, and the faint glow only made the darkness outside seem thicker, as though it pressed against the windows in slow, pulsing waves. Somewhere beneath the bridge, that slow, seismic thump resonated again, rolling upward through the steel and into my bones, a pulse that did not belong to any human-made structure. I stood perfectly still, not out of obedience to the toll monitor's warning, not out of logic or discipline, but because my body had surrendered entirely to a fear that felt older than thought, older than instinct. My hands hovered uselessly at my sides, palms prickling, sweat cooling into a thin sheen that froze almost immediately in the draft slipping through the booth's aging seams. It took nearly half a minute before my eyes adjusted enough to make out the faintest outline of the truck, the silhouette of its cab, the gentle slope of its hood, the rigid angles of the doors like the sketch of a vehicle drawn onto the darkness with the thinnest possible ink. The driver sat exactly where he had been, unmoving, the suggestion of his faceless head tilted toward me in perfect, sickening attention. But the worst part, the part that made my breath catch in my throat with a quiet choke, was that the figure in the back seat no longer looked compressed or confined by the truck's interior. It seemed taller now, fuller, as though the darkness itself had thickened into shape around it, giving it more structure, more weight, more space to occupy. I tried to reason through the impossible geometry of it, but my thoughts scattered the moment the toll monitor chimed again. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but it cracked through the silence with the precision of a blade. I turned toward the screen slowly, like my head were a heavy object I had to lift inch by inch. New green text glowed on the display, faint at first, then sharpening with terrible clarity. Do not run. A hollow dryness spread through my chest. The booth was too small to run in anyway. There was nowhere to go. Even if I sprinted out into the cold, the fog was so dense I would lose my orientation in seconds, and the bridge's edge was only yards from the booth. One wrong step in the disorienting dark and I would drop 50 feet into the half-frozen river. But that wasn't why my legs refused to move. Movement felt like it would draw something toward me, something that had waited patiently for movement in previous iterations of this night. Something that had tracked the rhythms of the loop so closely that any change would feel like an invitation. The truck shifted, not loudly, not even in a way that sounded mechanical. It moved with a soft, dragging sound, like cloth sliding across glass or ice being pulled slowly from a mold. The cab dipped forward by no more than an inch, but that slight motion sent another pulse through the bridge, a metallic groan that echoed up through the floor and into the booth walls. My breath hitched. The truck had never moved independently before. Every prior crossing had been a perfect, silent glide from the fog into the booth and back into the fog again. But now the driver, or whatever wore the shape of the driver, had tilted its head even farther toward me, and the outline of the backseat figure had unfolded another crooked limb, pressing it against the inside of the cab window with a gentle, deliberate pressure that fogged the glass instantly and etched a branching frost pattern in its wake. I took a tiny step backward, and immediately the booth reacted. The heater shut off, the fluorescent light buzzed loudly, then steadied, and beneath the booth floor, the bridge hummed, not a pulse this time, but a long, uninterrupted vibrational drone that seemed to bridge the distance between the booth and the truck, linking us in a single, trembling line of resonance. Then the monitor chimed again, a third message, one I did not want to read, one that landed in my mind with the force of an axe. Don't talk to it. My heart hammered against my ribs, frantic and hot under my skin, but my breath had turned icy, falling out of me in short, misting gusts. Talk to it? I hadn't said a single word since the booth had gone dark. I hadn't dared. Who had talked to it before? Who had broken the pattern? Who had given it reason to think communication was possible? Had someone else sat here on a night like this, watched this truck make its endless approach, and let the cycle draw them in? Had someone answered when the driver finally turned its head? The truck shifted again, this time pulling itself a few inches closer to the booth, as if testing boundaries it had not previously been allowed to cross. The gate had not lifted. The system had not triggered. The toll mechanism had not granted passage. But something else had something inside the loop, inside the memory of the bridge. Something that was not bound to the machinery of the booth or the number of vehicles recorded. The driver's hand rose, slowly, stiffly, not lifting so much as being lifted. It pressed against the driver's side window, palm first. The pale impression of its hand featureless, smooth spread of thin frost across the glass. The fingers elongated unnaturally, not bending, not flexing, but stretching, as if made of soft material being pulled into shape. And for the first time, sound emerged from the truck. Not a voice, not an engine, not metal shifting, a breath, a long, low exhale that fogged the glass so completely the entire cab blurred into whiteness. The sound rolled outward from the truck like a thin mist carried on a wave of cold air, and the temperature inside the booth dropped sharply. Frost bloomed along the bottom edge of the booth window. My fingertips went numb. The pen on the counter, my pen froze in place, ink stiffening halfway through the open ballpoint. The truck exhaled again. The frost on the window thickened, and this time, beneath the breath, I heard something else. A word, drawn out, half-formed, barely audible. Stay. I stumbled back, hitting the wall, my spine sending a jolt of pain up between my shoulders. Instantly, the truck stopped moving. The hum beneath the booth intensified, and the monitor chimed a final time. No text, no warning, just a single green cursor blinking, waiting. A realization dawned slowly. Like ice spreading through veins, the monitor wasn't issuing warnings. It was listening. It was waiting for a response I hadn't given. The cycle wasn't only repeating, it was seeking participation, and I had stayed long enough that the pattern finally recognized me as part of it. The bridge gave one final, massive lurch, an upward heave of steel and tension that rattled the toll booth so violently I fell to my knees. The lights flickered. The fog outside thinned, and for a fleeting instant, clarity cut through the night. I saw the truck not as a vehicle, but as a memory burned into the bridge, an imprint of a moment that had never resolved, a crossing that had ended in catastrophe 10 years earlier. A driver who had died on this very span when his brakes failed, when the bridge was slick with ice, when the river below claimed him before rescue ever arrived, and whatever had been inside the truck with him, whether grief or fear or something else entirely, had been trapped in the loop, replaying the final attempt to cross, trying again and again and again to finish a journey that could not be completed, until now, because now something living stood at the threshold of the cycle. The driver's head turned one last time, the featureless face impossibly close, pressing against the fogged window until its shape distorted. The backseat figure leaned forward until its presence filled the entire rear of the cab, its limbs bending with an unnatural softness that made my skin crawl. The booth door shuddered. A force pressed against it from the outside, not from the truck, from the bridge. The heartbeat beneath the steel rose in a crescendo. Thump, thump, thump. Then, just as suddenly, silence. The fog lifted entirely. The headlights of the truck flickered back on dim, hollow, ghostly, and the toll gate rose, not because the system triggered, not because the sensors registered weight, because the loop demanded continuation. The truck rolled forward, slow, heavy, final. The driver's head never turned away from me as it passed. And in that long, frozen stare, something inside my mind clicked into place with sickening certainty. It wasn't crossing the bridge. It was crossing through me. The moment the truck vanished into the fog on the far side, the toll monitor reset. Vehicle count, 0. System status, normal. Bridge load, stable. Everything exactly as it should have been, except the booth felt empty in a new way, not because the truck had gone, but because something had entered the space it left behind. Something that had stepped out of the loop once I'd stared too long, once I'd listened too closely, once I'd allowed myself to be part of the pattern. I lasted 3 more minutes before I fled into the cold night, abandoning my shift, abandoning the booth, abandoning the bridge entirely. I never went back. But sometimes, especially in winter, especially near bridges, when a truck passes me on a lonely road, I hear a second set of footsteps inside it, moving just a fraction of a second behind the first, walking through a cycle that still hasn't ended. And in the rearview mirror, for the briefest instant, I see 2 sets of headlights, one driving forward and one following just behind, waiting for the next crossing, waiting for the next witness, waiting for someone else to look long enough to join the loop. Story 4. The highway across northern Arizona can feel like another planet in December, especially after midnight, when the desert goes so dark and so quiet that even your own breathing seems too loud inside the car. I had been driving for nearly 7 hours already, the kind of long, uninterrupted stretch that makes the world flatten into a tunnel of headlights and the hum of tires on asphalt. And by the time the last gas station faded in my rearview mirror, the sky had already fallen into that star-choked blackness that only the high desert knows. The temperature outside had dropped below freezing, the air so dry it felt sharp in my lungs when I cracked the window for a little fresh air. My phone had been out of service for the last 40 miles. My dashboard clock had ticked past 1 a.m., and the desert, vast, ancient, indifferent, seemed to close over the road like a lid. I kept telling myself that I liked driving alone, that this solo trip home for winter break was a choice, not the result of every friend I had already leaving campus days earlier. But the truth was quieter and colder. I was alone on the highway because there was no one waiting for me to ride with. My music had cut out an hour earlier when the Bluetooth glitched, so I'd turned the radio off rather than listen to static. The silence took up residence in the car like a passenger. After a while, the monotony started to grind on me. My eyelids felt heavy. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The braided asphalt ahead shimmered under the beams of my headlights, revealing nothing but endless road and the blurred silhouettes of desert shrubs leaning in toward the shoulder like they were listening for something. I told myself I'd stop soon, just 20 more miles to the next rest area, maybe 30 at most, but the loneliness of the drive had grown thick enough that the idea of pulling off the main road felt strange, almost wrong. Out here, rest stops looked abandoned even during the day. and at night they were nothing but concrete islands marooned in a black sea. Still, the fatigue crept in, inch by inch, until my eyes burned when I blinked and my focus drifted toward the edges of the road instead of the center. That was when I saw the sign, a small metal rectangle, half lit by my headlights, leaning at an odd angle as though someone had pushed it into the dirt only halfway. The reflective lettering glinted a dull gold. Emergency detour. Broken arrow. I slowed instinctively, because the sign looked wrong. Not in the obvious horror movie way, not blood-stained or crooked or ominous, but in the subtle, mundane way that things sometimes go wrong in the real world. The bolts were mismatched. The metal is older than the reflective paint. And the phrase, emergency detour, hadn't been used on Arizona highway signage in years, and there had been a whole infrastructure update that phased those out. I stared at it as my car rolled past, craning my neck to catch any other indicators, cones, flashing lights. Another sign, but there was nothing else, only a narrow dirt road branching off to the right and vanishing into the darkness between two low sandstone ridges. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, just the result of fatigue making the ordinary look strange. But the sign was real, and the road was real, and something about the way the headlights skidded across that dirt path made the hair rise on my arms, as if the car itself had recognized the wrongness before I did. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of me knew that. But the desert had been empty for so long, the highway so repetitive, that even the smallest change felt like a relief. I slowed further, leaning my head toward the windshield, searching for construction markers or police lights or anything that would indicate a legitimate detour. My tires rolled over a patch of cracked asphalt, and the vibration jolted me fully awake. The dirt road looked smooth, recently driven on, and the sign looked like it had been placed just hours ago, its reflective paint too clean, too new for something that belonged out here. Fatigue does strange things to the mind. It makes caution feel like paranoia. It makes curiosity feel like reason. I flicked my turn signal out of habit rather than necessity, since no one else was on the road and the click, click, click echoed through the silent cabin like a metronome for my hesitation. The yellow light blinked against the desert rock. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt that small, dangerous moment of indecision stretch longer than it should have. Then, with a quiet exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding, I turned onto the dirt road. The asphalt dropped away with a soft thump. Gravel crackled beneath my tires. The headlights swept across pale sand and low brush, revealing nothing ahead but a straight, narrow path flanked by rocks that cast long shadows under the moonlight. The sky overhead seemed to darken further. The air through the cracked window tasted metallic, as though the cold itself had teeth. I kept driving. For the first 100 yards, the detour looked fine. Ordinary, forgettable. Then my phone buzzed in the cup holder. Once, a single vibration. I frowned. No service for the last hour, no towers for miles. I picked it up, expecting a low battery warning. Instead, a text message glowed on the cracked screen. A single line. No name attached. No number I recognized. Just a set of coordinates. My exact location, down to the meter. The message had been sent 30 seconds ago, right after I turned onto the dirt road. And beneath the coordinates was a second line, typed in a way that made something cold and ancient lock itself around my spine. Don't stop. For a long, dizzying moment after that message appeared on my phone screen, I forgot I was even driving. My eyes locked onto the coordinates, those impossibly precise numbers that mapped my exact position on that dirt road, and the world outside the windshield smeared into a blur of desert rock and drifting dust. The glow of the phone screen washed my hands in pale blue light, and all I could think was someone is watching me right now. Not later, not earlier, now. Watching me turn onto a road I should never have taken, watching me drive deeper into a place with no lights. No landmarks, no witnesses. The phone vibrated again, a small, stuttering buzz that jolted my senses back into my body, and I finally forced my gaze upward, back to the road. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding so violently I felt the thud of it in my fingertips. The dirt road had narrowed while I'd been distracted, the shoulders creeping closer, the desert brush rising like rows of dark, skeletal hands on either side. For a split second, I considered slamming the brakes and reversing all the way back to the highway. But the phone buzzed again, demanding my attention in a way that felt alarmingly deliberate. I glanced at it long enough to catch the preview. "Don't turn around," sent from the same unlisted number. No sender name, no signature. The road curved ahead, a soft, unmarked bend that my headlights struggled to trace. The sign behind me, the emergency detour that hadn't existed on any dot map for decades, was now far out of sight. I eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the car coast until the tires crunched against a patch of loose gravel that sent a dry hiss up into the night. My own breathing sounded too loud in the cabin. My ears rang with the shock of it all. Someone knows exactly where I am. Someone knows I turned. Someone knows I hesitated. I swallowed the rising panic and forced the car to crawl forward just enough to clear the bend in the road. The desert opened slightly, giving me a glimpse of a low ridgeline and a valley that was darker than the rest of the night, shadowed in a way that made it look almost hollow. The moonlight skated across patches of rock, catching on the pale, fossilized ridges of ancient sandstone. The dirt path wound downward, its edges worn into shallow grooves, as though many tires had traveled it recently, more recently than the neglected highway would have warranted. My phone vibrated again. Not once, 3 times. Rapid, urgent, my pulse spiked. I wasn't gonna look. Not this time. Not while the road narrowed again and funneled me between 2 stone outcroppings that rose like gates. I waited until I reached a straighter stretch of road. Then, reluctantly, I grabbed the phone one-handed, holding the wheel with the other. 3 new messages, all blank, just timestamps, all sent within seconds of each other, like someone typing quickly and then deleting the words before hitting send, or like someone trying to tell me something they couldn't articulate. My thumb hovered over the reply box. I typed, "Who is this?" The message disappeared into the void of the desert sky. No service bars in sight. The scent indicator spinning for a full 3 seconds before it collapsed into a red warning. Failed to send. I wasn't surprised, but I was terrified of what it meant that the messages reaching me weren't failing at all. As if in response to that thought, another message arrived instantly, so fast it felt impossible that someone had typed it. "Keep going. Left ahead." My headlight swept across a fork in the dirt road that hadn't been visible until the last moment, to a split where the main path continued straight into deeper darkness and a narrower branch veered left, climbing toward the ridgeline through a series of tight curves carved into the rock. I slowed to a crawl, staring at the left-hand track. It looked barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The incline was steep. The edges crumbled into low ravines on either side. It looked like a place where no sane person would drive at night. I stared down at the message again, thumb trembling. Then another buzz. "Trust me, you don't have long." Something cold rippled through me. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something like the faintest thread of warning or urgency woven into those 4 words. The sender didn't sound like a predator. The messages hadn't tried to lure me into stopping or turning around. They hadn't asked me to speak, to respond, to identify myself. They had told me to keep moving. They had told me not to turn around. They had told me I didn't have long. That didn't feel like a trap. It felt like an attempt to keep me out of one. I reached the fork. The main road stretched ahead, flat, dark, open. The left-hand path waded narrow, slanted, unfriendly, wrong. My phone vibrated again, and this time the message was just one word. "Please." Something broke in me at that. Not fear, something closer to instinct, something primal and unexplainable. Something that whispered that whatever had been sending these messages did not want to harm me. It wanted me away from the main path, away from where I thought safety lay, away from something else, without letting myself reconsider. I turned left. The incline seized the tires immediately, the engine grumbling as the car climbed. Pebbles scattered under the strain, skittering down the slope like beads of glass. The ledge on my right dropped into a gully I couldn't see the bottom of. My high beams caught only glimpses of the path ahead, flashes of bleached stone, shadows that seemed to move when I blinked, a ridge cresting like the edge of a blade. The phone buzzed once more. This time, The message was longer, and it made my blood run cold. The road behind you isn't empty. Don't look. Don't stop. I'll tell you when it's safe. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. My foot pressed harder to the gas, and I did not look in the mirror. Not even once, but in the black glass of the windshield, just faintly, I saw movement. Something coming up the road behind me. Something without headlights. Something tall enough to eclipse the stars. And my phone buzzed again. This time, with a warning. It's almost here. Drive. For a long, dizzying moment after that message appeared on my phone screen, I forgot I was even driving. My eyes locked onto the coordinates, those impossibly precise numbers that mapped my exact position on that dirt road, and the world outside the windshield smeared into a blur of desert rock and drifting dust. The glow of the phone screen washed my hands in pale blue light, and all I could think was someone is watching me right now. Not later, not earlier. Now, watching me turn onto a road I should never have taken, watching me drive deeper into a place with no lights, no landmarks, no witnesses. The phone vibrated again, a small, stuttering buzz that jolted my senses back into my body, and I finally forced my gaze upward, back to the road. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding so violently I felt the thud of it in my fingertips. The dirt road had narrowed while I'd been distracted, the shoulders creeping closer, the desert brush rising like rows of dark, skeletal hands on either side. For a split second, I considered slamming the brakes and reversing all the way back to the highway, but the phone buzzed again, demanding my attention in a way that felt alarmingly deliberate. I glanced at it long enough to catch the preview. "Don't turn around," sent from the same unlisted number. No sender name, no signature. The road curved ahead, a soft, unmarked bend that my headlights struggled to trace. The sign behind me, the emergency detour that hadn't existed on any dot map for decades, was now far out of sight. I eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the car coast until the tires crunched against a patch of loose gravel that sent a dry hiss up into the night. My own breathing sounded too loud in the cabin. My ears rang with the shock of it all. Someone knows exactly where I am. Someone knows I turned. Someone knows I hesitated. I swallowed the rising panic and forced the car to crawl forward just enough to clear the bend in the road. The desert opened slightly, giving me a glimpse of a low ridge line and a valley that was darker than the rest of the night, shadowed in a way that made it look almost hollow. The moonlight skated across patches of rock, catching on the pale, fossilized ridges of ancient sandstone. The dirt path wound downward, its edges worn into shallow grooves, as though many tires had traveled it recently, more recently than the neglected highway would have warranted. My phone vibrated again. Not once, 3 times. Rapid, urgent. My pulse spiked. I wasn't gonna look. Not this time. Not while the road narrowed again and funneled me between 2 stone outcroppings that rose like gates. I waited until I reached a straighter stretch of road. Then, reluctantly, I grabbed the phone one-handed, holding the wheel with the other. 3 new messages, all blank, just timestamps, all sent within seconds of each other, like someone typing quickly and then deleting the words before hitting send, or like someone trying to tell me something they couldn't articulate. My thumb hovered over the reply box. I typed, "Who is this?" The message disappeared into the void of the desert sky. No service bars in sight. The scent indicator spinning for a full 3 seconds before it collapsed into a red warning. Failed to send. I wasn't surprised, but I was terrified of what it meant that the messages reaching me weren't failing at all. As if in response to that thought, another message arrived instantly, so fast it felt impossible that someone had typed it. "Keep going. Left ahead." My headlights swept across a fork in the dirt road that hadn't been visible until the last moment. A split where the main path continued, straight into deeper darkness, and a narrower branch veered left, climbing toward the ridgeline through a series of tight curves carved into the rock. I slowed to a crawl, staring at the left-hand track. It looked barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The incline was steep. The edges crumbled into low ravines on either side. It looked like a place where no sane person would drive at night. I stared down at the message again, thumb trembling. Then, another buzz. "Trust me, you don't have long." Something cold rippled through me. Fear. Yes, but something else too. Something like the faintest thread of warning or urgency woven into those 4 words. The sender didn't sound like a predator. The messages hadn't tried to lure me into stopping or turning around. They hadn't asked me to speak, to respond, to identify myself. They had told me to keep moving. They had told me not to turn around. They had told me I didn't have long. That didn't feel like a trap. It felt like an attempt to keep me out of one. I reached the fork. The main road stretched ahead, flat, dark, open. The left-hand path waited narrow, slanted, unfriendly, wrong. My phone vibrated again, and this time the message was just 1 word. Please. Something broke in me at that. Not fear, something closer to instinct. Something primal and unexplainable. Something that whispered that whatever had been sending these messages did not want to harm me. It wanted me away from the main path. Away from where I thought safety lay. Away from something else. Without letting myself reconsider, I turned left. The incline seized the tires immediately, the engine grumbling as the car climbed, pebbles scattered under the strain, skittering down the slope like beads of glass. The ledge on my right dropped into a gully I couldn't see the bottom of. My high beams caught only glimpses of the path ahead, flashes of bleached stone, shadows that seemed to move when I blinked, a ridge cresting like the edge of a blade. The phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was longer, and it made my blood run cold. The road behind you isn't empty. Don't look. Don't stop. I'll tell you when it's safe. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. My foot pressed harder to the gas. And I did not look in the mirror, not even once. But in the black glass of the windshield, just faintly, I saw movement, something coming up the road behind me, something without headlights, something tall enough to eclipse the stars, and my phone buzzed again, this time with a warning. It's almost here. Drive. The climb became steeper, and the engine labored with a strained whine that made every nerve in my body tighten as if the car itself were begging me not to stop, because the moment the wheels slipped on a patch of loose gravel and the car stuttered sideways for half a breath, I felt something shift in the darkness behind me. Not the way a person shifts, not the way an animal shifts, but the way a vast and heavy object adjusts its weight as though to pursue more efficiently. And I kept my eyes forward with the desperate concentration of someone trying not to drown. Fingers clenched around the wheel until my knuckles ached under the tension. The road ahead curved sharply, the kind of turn that could send a car tumbling down the ravine if taken too fast, but the alternative, slowing down, felt like leaning backward into a set of open jaws, so I braked only enough to keep control, letting the car drift around the bend with a shudder that rattled through the chassis like a warning. The high beams caught the stony wall to my left, illuminating streaks of mineral deposits, cracks in the sandstone, the faint outline of tire tracks, fresh ones leading further up the winding path, proof that someone else had traveled this way not long ago, someone who had placed the sign, someone who had sent the messages, someone who had perhaps tried to escape the same thing now stalking the road behind me. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't dare look, not until I reached another brief straightaway where the terrain leveled for a handful of seconds, and when I finally flicked my gaze downward, the message on the screen felt like a hand closing around my throat. Don't let it see your face. The letters glowed faintly in the darkness, trembling slightly with the vibrations of the engine, and the moment they registered, I realized how cold the air in the car had become, how a thin sheen of frost was creeping along the inside edge of the windshield, despite the heater still running, how my breath was fogging faster, thicker, as though something was drawing the warmth from the cabin, from me, from every living thing within its reach. The next bend in the road appeared in the headlights, a sweeping arc that curved along the edge of the ridge, and I took it at a cautious speed because the drop beside me was sheer. But the moment the car leaned into the turn, the world behind me tilted just enough that my peripheral vision caught movement in the rear window. A shape too tall, too angular, moving with a strange weightless stride, as though its body were made of darkness poured into a humanoid mold. I jerked my eyes forward instantly, heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought it might crack something. But the shape had been real. I felt it in the way the temperature plunged another degree, in the way the gravel behind me shifted under its impossible gait, in the way the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the night were not meant to witness this creature moving freely. The ridge leveled into a small plateau, a narrow shelf where the dirt road spread into a flat expanse before narrowing again into a tighter, darker corridor between two jagged towers of rock. My headlights washed over the open space, revealing scattered brush, a rusted road marker half buried in sand, and something else, a faint marking in the dirt, as though someone had dragged their hand across the ground in a desperate attempt to leave a message. I didn't have time to read it. My phone buzzed, and this message was longer, more frantic, typed in bursts, as though the sender's hands were shaking. It can't cross the ridge. You're almost high enough. Just don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't look back. My foot pressed harder to the gas, the wheels spinning for a second before gripping, the car lunging forward across the plateau, and the engine's roar filled the cabin like a living thing. But over it, under it, I heard footsteps. Heavy ones. Running. Getting closer. The dirt road trembled with each impact, sending tiny vibrations up through the floorboards and into my feet, and the rattling items in my cup holder jangled together like the shaking of a warning bell. I couldn't help it. I let out a thin, involuntary gasp, and the sound seemed to draw the creature's attention, because the next footfall was so heavy it cracked the crust of frozen dirt behind me, and the tail end of the car fishtailed as the tires lost traction for a heartbeat. I gripped the wheel harder, whispered please, please, under my breath without realizing it, and focused every ounce of will on keeping the car steady across the plateau as the road narrowed again between the tall stone walls. The darkness inside that corridor was thicker, swallowing the edges of my high beams, and the moment I crossed into it, the footsteps stopped. Completely. Not slowing, not fading, just stopped, as though the creature had reached a boundary it couldn't cross. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was sharp, expectant, predatory, the kind of silence that waits. I kept driving, the walls closing in so tightly that my side mirrors nearly brushed the jagged rock. The temperature in the car began to rise again, only slightly, but enough to suggest I had crossed some invisible threshold. And then, finally, the corridor opened onto a wider ledge, a flat plain of pale stone, a cliff edge. My headlights hit a wooden post, a sign nailed to it, old, weather-worn, the words, barely legible in flaking white paint, broken arrow staging area, 0.7 miles. My breath hitched so hard my chest ached. The name from the detour sign, the name from the emergency warning. It was real. It existed. The sign wasn't fake. The detour wasn't random. Someone, something, had wanted me to reach this place. My phone buzzed again. I forced my trembling hand to look. The message read, "Good. Now stay on the left side. Do not follow the tracks." They're not from a vehicle. I looked up immediately. Dozens of tracks crisscrossed the wide stone ahead, long, deep impressions running parallel to the cliff edge and snaking into the shadows. At first glance, they looked like tire marks. Then I realized they were too long between points of pressure, too narrow, too inconsistent, too deep. Not tire marks, footprints, something with a stride twice the length of a human's, something dragging weight behind it. My phone buzzed again. The message made my skin tighten so fast. My whole body flinched. If you hear it again, you have to drive faster. It knows you're here. It knows you saw the road. I swallowed hard. My pulse thudded in my ears. I drove, left side of the clearing, as far from the tracks as I could get. For a moment, a single, fragile moment, I thought maybe I would make it. Then, very softly, from somewhere behind me, I heard breathing. Slow, wet, close, and my phone buzzed again. This time, just 2 words. It climbed. The sound of that breathing, slow, wet, impossibly close, unraveled something deep in my spine, a cold loosening that felt like every strand of instinct I had left was trying to pull me out of my own skin and force me to flee, even though there was nowhere left to go except forward along that pale, windswept ledge. I gripped the wheel so tightly the textured rubber left grooves in my palms, and for a long, sickening second, I couldn't tell if the shaking of the wheel came from the uneven stone beneath the tires or from my own hands trembling under the weight of what was following me. The car crept along the left side of the clearing, staying far from the long, inhuman impressions carved into the dusty stone. But every inch forward felt like stepping onto thinner and thinner ice, like the night was watching me choose the wrong squares in a game whose rules I didn't understand. Wind surged suddenly across the cliff, cold and sharp, carrying with it the faintest hint of something organic, an earthy, metallic scent that didn't belong to the desert at all, like old blood drying on fabric or animal breath condensing in winter air. It didn't smell human. It didn't smell alive. It smelled like something that had been alive once and was imitating the memory of breath purely out of habit. My phone vibrated with such force it nearly jumped out of the cup holder. I grabbed it without looking away from the narrow strip of safe terrain ahead, because I already knew that if I glanced into any reflective surface, even the faint gloss of the dashboard, I might catch a glimpse of whatever had climbed the ridge behind me, and I felt with an absolute, marrow-deep certainty that seeing it would be a mistake. I wouldn't survive. The message was short, typed so fast the letters were uneven. Don't let it hear your heartbeat. My own heartbeat reacted instantly, pounding harder, faster, as though trying to break out of my ribs entirely, and I fought the physiological panic with the same desperation as someone trying to smother a scream underwater. I pressed my back harder into the seat, trying to minimize movement, willing my body to quiet down, to shrink into the smallest possible version of myself. But the breathing behind me grew louder, closer, as if the creature were matching its exhalations to the rhythm of mine, waiting for me to slip, waiting for the pattern to break so it could anchor onto it. The road narrowed again, slanting toward a second corridor carved between two leaning stone plates that formed a jagged arch overhead. The headlights revealed thin slashes in the rock marks that looked like claw gouges, or perhaps like something had dragged its fingers along the stone walls while squeezing through. I eased the car into the archway, praying the creature was too large to follow. The instant the tires crossed the threshold of shadow, the breathing stopped, not faded, not receded, stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so unnervingly total, that it felt like the desert itself was holding its breath with me. The temperature inside the car rose by a degree, then another, as though the thing's proximity had been leaching the warmth from the air. And now that I was inside the corridor, sheltered by the rock, the cold influence had been cut off. But I didn't trust it. Silence was almost worse. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant thought. Silence meant it was choosing its next move. The car rolled out of the narrow passage and onto another plateau, smaller than the last. This one was marked by an old chain-link fence sagging between two rusted posts, a faded wooden sign hanging crookedly behind it. My headlights caught the peeling paint. Broken Arrow operations. Authorized personnel only. The words sent another shiver through me, not because the place existed, but because it shouldn't have. I'd studied maps of this area for a geology elective the year before, and nothing like this had ever appeared on any topographic survey or field marker. The fence was new enough to still hold shape, but old enough to be forgotten. The kind of structure that had been abandoned by the people who built it, but remembered by the land itself in ways that didn't make sense. My phone buzzed again. You're almost out. Go to the gate. Don't look right. Don't look up. The specificity of the instruction made my entire body tense. I drove toward the gate slowly, headlights sweeping across the fence, illuminating coils of barbed wire, metal glinting faintly under the moon. The breeze shifted, and with it came a sound soft, whispering, almost like fabric brushing against stone, drifting from my right. My instinct screamed to turn my head, to see what the sound belonged to, but the warning on the screen pulsed in my mind with stark, electric clarity. Don't look right. The whispering grew louder, edging into the periphery of my hearing, as though something tall and thin were dragging itself in parallel with the car, its movement light but intentional, perfectly timing each shift with the rotation of my tires. My hands sweated against the wheel. My mouth went dry. Another sound rose overhead, something faint and rhythmic, like fingers tapping on metal, but I kept my gaze locked forward, fighting the magnetic pull of curiosity that wanted desperately to identify the shape of the thing that had climbed The ridge. The gate loomed ahead, chained but loosely, hanging open just enough that a single vehicle could squeeze through. My headlights brightened the gap, and for a horrifying second I saw impressions in the dirt on the other side, deep, spaced, wide apart, and pressed into the earth with so much force the soil had cracked around the edges. The thing had been here, maybe, moments ago, maybe waiting. My phone buzzed again. The message was shorter this time, more urgent, almost panicked. Do not stop at the fence. It knows you're close. I accelerated through the gap, the metal chain scraping softly against my passenger side mirror with a metallic hiss. Once on the other side, the terrain shifted dramatically. The dirt path dipped sharply, curving into a narrow descent that looked almost like a dried riverbed, flanked by dead mesquite branches that reached toward the car like brittle fingers. The breathing behind me returned louder, more ragged, as if the creature had dropped from the ridge and resumed its pursuit on the other side of the fence. Then something hit the dirt behind me, hard, heavy, close. The impact shook the ground, sending a puff of dust swirling up into my taillights. My phone buzzed. One final message. So stark, it felt like an order inscribed into bone. It's running. You have to go now. I slammed the accelerator. The engine roared. The car tore down the slope, and behind me, too close, far too close. I heard it sprint. Not four-legged, not human. Something caught between the two, moving with a terrible efficiency, using the stone walls to propel itself forward in monstrous, angular strides. The ravine bent sharply ahead one last curve, and as I skidded into it, heart exploding against my ribs, I felt the air behind me compress, like something enormous had leapt. Then, nothing. No impact. No claws. No breath. Just absence, like the creature had vanished mid-motion, like it had crossed some invisible threshold and been torn out of the world. The car shot out of the ravine, tires kicking up gravel, and the desert opened before me, a long, sloping path leading back toward the faint glimmer of highway lights in the distance. I didn't look back, not once, but the desert behind me felt wrong, hollow and bruised and recovering from something that had just been ripped out of its skin. Only when I was nearly a mile away did my phone buzz one final time. A single message, no coordinates, no warning, no sender. Just, I pushed it back. Drive until sunrise. Don't take calls from unknown numbers. And whatever you do, never follow a detour after midnight. What follows is the version you'll hear on a radio station at 2 a.m. The long, unbroken kind of telling meant to keep you awake even when your eyes want to close. The kind where every word tries to explain something that still trembles just outside the edge of memory. I drove until the sky began to gray at the farthest rim of the desert, the horizon stretching into a pale, metallic line that looked more like a scar than a sunrise. The highway felt unreal when I finally reached it, too familiar, too safe, too clean after everything that had happened. Yellow lane reflectors flickered beneath my tires in a steady rhythm that should have calmed me, but every time the pattern repeated thud, 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 thud. I could still hear the echo of something running behind my car, a weight hitting the ground with inhuman force, matching the tempo of my breath, hunting not with hunger but with precision. I didn't look at the rearview mirror. I had no interest in learning whether the desert would show me what I already knew was no longer there. The thing hadn't followed me out of the ravine. It hadn't chased me onto the highway. But the silence it left behind felt like a wound more than a relief. What unsettled me most was not the creature, or the footprints, or the way the desert seemed to watch me. It was the messages. Every few minutes, as I drove, I checked my phone the way someone checks a pulse, cautiously, with dread, expecting to find the thread still alive. But my service bars flickered uselessly between no signal and SOS only, and the message thread, those frantic, impossible texts that had guided me step by step out of the nightmare, was frozen at the final warning. There were no new messages, no typing indicators, no trace of the sender. Almost as if the signal had died the moment I escaped the ridge. Almost as if the person sending the messages had not survived the encounter that originally trapped them out there. By the time the sun crested the horizon, the sky a washed-out watercolor of pink and steel blue, I finally felt the car stop shaking beneath me. The light hit the desert floor in long, clean lines. Everything looked different in daylight, gentle even, as though nothing terrifying had ever lived in the crevices of stone or crawled across the ridge under moonlight, but the illusion didn't hold. At the first gas station I reached nearly 80 miles from where the detour had begun. I pulled into a parking spot and sat in the car with the engine running. The fluorescent canopy lights buzzed overhead. A trucker filled his tank 2 pumps over. A woman in a heavy jacket walked her dog beneath a mesquite tree. It was all painfully ordinary, and yet the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the desert behind me, heavy, ancient, silent. Inside the gas station, I bought coffee I didn't drink and stood by the door, letting the relative safety of other people wash over me like a shield that wasn't quite big enough. I hesitated before pulling out my phone again. There was still no signal. The message thread remained intact, as if the whole night had been nothing more than a strange, cruel dream. But there was something at the bottom of the screen I hadn't noticed before. A small gray line of text, dimmer than the timestamps, nearly invisible unless the light hit the screen at the right angle. Conversation archived 2:48 a.m. Restored 3:13 a.m. Archived by whom? Restored by what? Before I could look closer, the phone buzzed. My body locked up, every muscle seized, my breath cut short. I knew that vibration. I knew what it meant. My pulse hammered in my throat as I turned the phone over. One new message, from the same number that had no name, no location, no origin. The text preview read, "Thank you." A hollow, sinking sensation pulled through my ribcage as I tapped the notification. The full message opened. "Thank you. It wasn't always that fast. You helped me finish the path. I can rest now. I hope you never see what I saw. Please." There was a pause, several seconds where the typing indicator blinked as if something on the other end was struggling to form the right words. Then the final line appeared. "Don't go home the same way." Before I could even gasp, the message thread blinked, flickered, vanished. Not just the last message, the entire conversation. Every text, every warning, every coordinate, gone, replaced with a blank screen, a blank number, a blank history. Like no one had ever contacted me at all. I stood there, the gas station spinning just slightly around me, cold fingers tightening around the edges of my phone. Outside, the desert stretched out under the rising sun, wide, endless, indifferent, but somewhere beneath that calm surface, I felt the truth settling like dust. Someone had guided me through that night. Someone had known the creature. Someone had died on that road long before I ever turned onto it. And their last act, their last warning, was not a plea to save myself. It was a plea not to follow the path they died on. I didn't go home the same way. I haven't taken a back road or midnight detour since, and when I drive after dark, even now, I keep my music loud, and my mirrors angled down, so I can't see the road behind me. Because sometimes, in the quiet between stations, when the engine hums just right, I swear I still hear footsteps on the pavement behind my car. Long strides, heavy and uneven, keeping pace with me at a distance I never want to measure. And every December, without fail, my phone buzzes once at 2:48 a.m. No message, no number, just a single vibration, like someone checking in, like someone making sure I'm still alive. A reminder of the night I followed the wrong detour, into the place where the desert keeps its dead. Story 5. The night before Christmas Eve is usually slow for outbound call centers. Slower still when the first snowstorm of the season is pressing against the windows with a steady, patient insistence that makes the entire building feel like it's drifting deeper into winter with every passing hour. I remember walking into the office that evening with the collar of my coat pulled high against the cold, my breath a thin white cloud in front of me, and the glass door resisting my push as though the wind outside had grown hands and was trying to pull me back out into the dark. Inside, the overhead fluorescence hummed with that faint, tired buzz that old fixtures get in December, the blue-gray light flattening the cubicles into rows of identical coffins. A few strands of tinsel drooped from the tops of the dividers, and someone had taped a paper snowman near the break room that looked more haunted than festive. Most of my coworkers had already left for the holiday, leaving the call center half empty, the aisles between desks dim and strangely cavernous. Only the night shift remained 4 of us. scattered like forgotten chess pieces across the far end of the floor. I took my usual seat near the window, where the view of the parking lot and the skeletal outline of the office park beyond usually made me feel less boxed in. But that night the snow came down in slow sheets, muting every light into a soft, blurred glow, turning the world outside into a blank, white void. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, tired, hair bundled into a loose knot, headset crooked over one ear, a faint smudge of yesterday's mascara under my eyes. We weren't supposed to get any more inbound calls after 10 p.m. company policy, but outbound work kept the lights on, and the script for the holiday charity campaign was taped to the desk in front of me, creased from overuse. Hello, this is Clara from Northern Hope Outreach. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Cold calls to donors who might or might not pick up. Most wouldn't, most never did. But the rhythm of the job, monotonous as it was, held me together. It was the stillness I couldn't handle. The long gaps between calls felt like the building was listening to me breathe, and every so often, a sound would crack through the winter silence, a pipe contracting, the ventilation system sighing, the elevator cables clattering far off in the dark, and each small noise felt amplified by the emptiness of the floor. Around 11:12 p.m., the storm intensified. Snow slapped against the windows like handfuls of thrown sand. The trees in the lot bowed beneath the wind. The building hummed with the strain of its own heating system trying to hold the line. The other agents chatted quietly 2 rows over, their voices muffled by distance and fabric-covered walls. I could hear the break room microwave beep, a chair squeak, the soft rustle of someone unwrapping a candy cane. Normal, ordinary, harmless. And then my screen flashed with an incoming call. For a moment, I just stared at it. Inbound call, unknown number, 11:13 p.m. Inbound? Impossible. The system shouldn't be routing inbound calls at this hour. A cold thread wound its way down my spine. I reached out, hesitated, then answered anyway because protocol was so deeply ingrained that my body acted before my mind had caught up. My voice came out polite, steady, professional. Thank you for calling Northern Hope Outreach. This is Clara. How may I? A man's voice cut in, soft, quivering, breathy. Clara, is that your name? His tone wasn't threatening, not aggressive, not mocking. If anything, it sounded fragile, like someone trying not to be heard by whoever else might be near him. Yes, I said carefully. This is Clara. The long pause followed so long I thought the call had dropped, but then I heard him breathe, a shake in the exhale, a sound like someone pressing a palm over the receiver and failing to cover it completely. I want to give something, he said finally. A donation. For someone who needs help tonight. Like doom, I adjusted in my chair, trying to fall back into the familiar script. Of course, sir. I can assist with that. Who did you have in mind? Another breath, but this one didn't sound like hesitation. It sounded like fear, wet, uneven, close to crying. The man outside your building, he whispered. The one who's been waiting there a long time. My entire body went still. I glanced toward the window, instinctively at the swirling snow. The parking lot blurred almost to white, but I saw nothing beyond the storm. No silhouette, no movement, no person standing in the cold. Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. He inhaled sharply, as if my denial had hurt him. No, he's there. He's right there. Please don't sound confused. It makes him upset when people pretend they don't see him. A prickling spread across my scalp. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I swallowed, forced composure into my voice. And who is he? The man's whisper cracked into something urgent, desperate, trembling with a dread that didn't belong to someone safe or comfortable. I don't know his name, he said, but he knows yours. He's been saying it over and over. The snow outside thickened into a white curtain, and though I saw nothing in the storm, I felt, in that deep, ancient, animal part of the mind that knows when a predator is near, that something had shifted in the night. Something was out there, and it was waiting for me to look. For several seconds after the man said my name, said it the way someone might hold a fragile object, careful not to drop it, I couldn't get any air into my lungs. It wasn't fear at first, Not exactly. It was the kind of bewildered stillness your mind falls into when something doesn't fit anywhere in the world, you know. The snowstorm rattled the window beside me, rattled it so firmly I felt the vibration through the desk, and yet the cubicle row behind me remained painfully ordinary, faint keyboard taps, someone coughing into their elbow. The distant hum of the vending machine. Nothing in that familiarity matched the man's quivering whisper or the certainty in his tone. He keeps saying your name, the caller repeated, each word pushing through his throat like they hurt to speak. Clara. Over and over. He's imitating it now. The word imitating hit me in a strange way. Cold, precise, wrong. I lowered my voice. Sir, I don't understand. There's no one outside. Blaiswell. A small, broken laugh filtered through the receiver. The kind of laugh someone gives when they know something terrible but don't have the strength to say it plainly. Oh, Clara. You don't have to see him for him to see you. He's been waiting for you all night. A shiver ran the length of my spine. I couldn't help it. I turned toward the window again, leaning just enough to get a clearer view. The snow swirled in violent sheets under the parking lot lights, illuminated like millions of tiny sparks. And the few visible shapes, cars, shrubs, dumpsters, were half blurred by the whiteout. Nothing moved. Nothing stood out. But the longer I looked, the louder the wind grew, as though the storm itself were pushing me back, insisting the view outside was not meant to be studied. Behind me, someone shifted in their chair, a quick squeak of metal legs scratching the floor, and for a heartbeat that tiny sound grounded me. It reminded me I wasn't alone. I still had coworkers inside this building. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't crazy. There was nothing out there. There couldn't be. This call was just an unstable man projecting his fear onto me, but then he whispered again, closer this time, as if the phone itself were moving toward my ear. He's right under the light, Clara. He's just waiting for you to stop pretending. My pulse skipped, because I hadn't told him where I sat. I hadn't mentioned the window. I hadn't said anything about the parking lot lights. I straightened in my chair. Sir, how do you know where I am? A sound soft, choked escaped him. I shouldn't have called. They told me not to. I'm supposed to keep quiet. I'm only supposed to say the prayer. But your name, he won't stop repeating it. He inhaled sharply, trembling. He says it wrong. He says it like he's remembering the shape of your face while he does it. My throat tightened so sharply I had to pull the headset slightly away from my skin just to swallow. Sir, I'm going to ask again, are you near this building? No, the man said in a voice that was almost a sob. No, I'm nowhere near you. I'm not even in your state. Something icy slotted into my chest. Then why does your voice sound like you're standing right beside me? I thought, but I didn't say it. Instead, I asked, then how do you know someone is outside? A faint static crackled across the line. Then, very quietly, he answered, because he's the one who made me call you. My hand tightened around the mouse, knuckles whitening. What do you mean, made you? I'm not supposed to talk about myself, he whispered. I'm supposed to tell you about him. About the man who needs help. About the one who waits at doors. Something thumped softly against the window behind me. Just one sound, a dull, heavy knock, muted by snow, but unmistakably human. I froze. The caller exhaled a shuddering breath that broke into a soft cry. Oh God. He moved closer, didn't he? Another thud, this time lower, on the glass, like someone dragging something across it. My breath fogged the inside of my headset. Sir, who's outside this building? No, he whispered. That's the wrong question. Another pause, a long one, long enough that the storm filled the silence with its teeth. Then, in a voice small and terrified and filled with a certainty that made every hair on my body rise, he said, ask me who used to be inside. A chill spilled down my back. I didn't move. Couldn't. Sir, who are you talking about? The caller's voice thinned into raw, trembling thread. I think he worked there. I think he knew your floor. I think he knows the layout in the dark. He said he remembers the cold hallway near the elevator. He said he remembers the chair with the broken armrest. My eyes darted to my own chair. The right armrest had a crack in it. A small, harmless flaw. I'd never thought twice about it. The caller continued. He said he remembers the girl who sat by the window, the one who always stayed late. My mouth went dry. That was me. That had been me for months. The man sobbed softly. I'm just supposed to warn you he's coming. I'm supposed to tell you that he wants to see if you'll be kind, if you'll open the door, because once you show kindness, he can come inside. Then, as if he had been dreading the words the entire call, he whispered, he told me to tell you he's tired of being out in the snow. And right on cue, as though the words were a signal, a third sound struck the window, closer, heavier, higher on the glass this time, like a head resting against it, like breath fogging from the other side. And then, gently, distinctly, someone whispered my name, not from the headset, not from the caller, from the window, through the glass, as though lips were pressed against the frozen pane. For a moment after I heard my name whispered through the window, quiet, intimate, close enough that the breath of it seemed to melt a small circle of frost on the other side of the glass. I couldn't tell if I was still in my body or hovering just outside it, some stunned, half-disbelieving version of myself that had been jarred loose by fear. I didn't turn toward the sound. I didn't even breathe. Every instinct I had was shouting that if I acknowledged the presence outside, if I reacted or looked or even shifted in my seat, it would understand that I heard it, that I recognized it, that I was aware of it, and something in the logic of the moment told me that was exactly what it wanted. The caller must have sensed my silence calcifying into near paralysis, because he spoke again, voice shaking so faintly that his words came through the receiver like brittle paper being torn one nerve at a time. Clara, don't look. Please don't look. He doesn't like when people look. That's when he tries to make them open the door. My mouth felt glued shut, my tongue heavy with terror. I swallowed, but the sound was too loud in my own head, as if the room around me had become a soundproof shell, amplifying every breath, every swallow, every tremor in my hands. I kept my gaze locked on the opposite wall, the cubicle fabric flickering under the harsh overhead bulb, and forced my voice to come out steady enough that it wouldn't betray the rising panic tremor in my chest. Sir, who is he? The caller inhaled sharply, an involuntary, fearful gasp. I don't know his name. Clara. He doesn't talk to me. He talks to you. Or he talks because of you. The receiver grew quieter, as though he had cupped both hands around it or bowed his head. He said he waited a long time for you to work tonight. He said he's been standing in the snow for an hour. He said you kept turning the lights on and off, and he watched your reflection while you adjusted them. My stomach turned so violently I had to grip the edge of my desk to keep my hands from shaking. The flickering lights earlier, the ones I assumed were just winter or voltage fluctuations, weren't random. Someone had been watching the brightness shift from outside. Someone had been tracking my movements in the glass long before I knew anyone was there. The caller continued, whispering faster now, like he was confessing under threat. He made me call from a number that wouldn't scare you. He said if you trust me, you might trust him. He said the charity line was a good place because you're used to hearing people in trouble. The caller's breath stuttered again. He said you'd open the door for someone who sounded desperate. A cold wave broke over me, washing every thought clean except for one. He's trying to get in through kindness. Something shifted outside. A soft, wet dragging sound, like fabric soaked through with meltwater moving against the pane. My coworkers were somewhere behind me, still 2 rows down, laughing quietly about something in the break room, but their voices felt impossibly far away, muffled by the storm and the rising pressure in my ears. I wanted to stand up, to walk toward them, to break myself out of the spell of stillness that had wrapped around my cubicle like a second skin. But the caller's next whisper pinned me exactly where I was. He's leaning closer. He wants you to answer him. My throat tightened painfully. Answer. How? With kindness, the man whispered. That's how he tests the doors. If the person is kind, the latch gives. I blinked slow, terrified. What latch? The caller's breath cracked into an audible wince. Not just the physical one, Clara. The one that keeps people like him out. A cold, heavy realization dropped into my ribs. He wasn't talking about locks. He wasn't talking about doors. He meant permission. He meant invitation. He meant the thin, invisible threshold between noticing and acknowledging, between hearing and answering, between fear and sympathy. Something tapped the window again, light, deliberate. I felt the vibration against my armrest. Then, through the storm-muted quiet, the whisper returned, my name, drawn out slowly, like someone trying to relearn the shape of each syllable. Clara. The voice didn't sound human, but it didn't sound monstrous either. It sounded practiced, as if the speaker only recently rediscovered what a voice was meant to do. The caller whimpered, "Don't answer. Clara, don't. If you respond, even a little, if you speak with warmth, if he hears concern, he'll know the door is ready." My pulse thudded like a drum line behind my ribs. "What door?" I whispered, barely audible, but the caller heard me. He choked on his own breath. "He thinks you owe him kindness because he died near that building." My stomach dropped. The caller continued, voice barely a thread now. "He says he remembers the office lights through the snow. He says he was outside when he needed help and no one came. He says he froze, waiting." My heart stopped, froze waiting by a door just like the one in our lobby, waiting for someone inside to notice, waiting for someone to care. And then, now he waits for someone else to choose differently. My vision dimmed at the edges. This wasn't a random threat. It wasn't a stranger. It was a story repeating itself. A soft scrape against the glass snapped my attention back. Then a shape, just the faintest blur of motion, shifted behind the frost on the window. And in a voice too close to be imagined, too steady to be wind, too patient to be human, the whisper came again. "Clara, let me in. It's cold." The caller inhaled, a trembling, tear-thin breath. "He's begging now," he said. "He told me to beg the same way before I died." And I did. "Why?" The line crackled. My skin crawled. "You're talking to me," I whispered slowly. "But you're saying you died?" The silence so deep it felt like the phone itself stopped breathing. Then, quietly, "Clara, I never said he let me go." And I finally understood. What was calling me wasn't the living. It was someone the thing outside had used before. Someone still bound to it. Someone trapped in its hunger for the kind of compassion that unlocks doors. And the moment that realization registered, the thing outside said my name a third time. Longer, softer, closer. "Clara." The caller sobbed. "Don't answer. If you do, he'll come inside to get warm." For a long, suspended moment after the caller warned me not to answer, it felt as if the entire call center had been emptied of air. The fluorescent lights hummed on. The heating vents shuddered with warm currents, and somewhere behind me I knew that my coworkers were still talking softly, unaware that something in the storm outside had singled out my window, my cubicle, me. But all of that familiar office noise had been pushed far into the background. Every sense I had was pulled toward the glass beside my desk, as if the window were a lung drawing the room inward. Behind that frost-blurred pane, something still waited, not moving, not knocking again, just waiting, listening. "Clara," the caller whispered, and his voice was almost gone now, as if each word was taken from him and had to be begged back. "You can't let him hear kindness. Don't say anything gentle. Don't ask if he's hurt. Don't say you're sorry." "No, please. I'm not going to." I murmured, automatic, defensive, then froze as soon as the words left my mouth because even that small whispered reassurance felt like a mistake, like something too close to warmth. The silence outside tightened, as if the world had leaned in to catch the shape of my voice through the thin layer of winter glass. The line crackled sharply like someone pressing their thumb against a telephone speaker hard enough to distort it. "Did he hear you?" the caller asked, the sound of panic bleeding through the tremor of his voice. "No," I whispered, quieter, harsher. I said it too low. Another mistake. Two soft syllables that slid beneath rational speech and felt like something between a plea and a prayer. The caller stifled a sob. "Please, Clara, please don't talk at all unless you have to." He listens for shape, not volume. I clamped my jaw shut immediately, breath caught halfway in my chest. And then, as if cued by the silence, something outside shifted. A soft, Wet movement. Against the glass. Not a hand. Something larger. Like the weight of a shoulder leaning against the pane. Like someone pressing closer to hear the breath inside. I stared straight ahead at my computer monitor at the script I'd read hundreds of times. At the glowing cursor blinking aimlessly in a notes field because I knew if I turned even a fraction of an inch toward the window, if I cast even a single glance at the shape behind the frost, it would count as acknowledgement, as recognition, as welcome. The caller spoke again, but now his voice was nearly indistinguishable from the static. Clara, he's trying to see your face. Don't turn toward him. Don't give him a reflection. That's how he learns the mouth again. A thick, trembling cold rose inside my throat. The mouth. The caller didn't answer at first, and in the space before he finally spoke, something dragged down the glass slow, deliberate, like fingers softened by cold, leaving long streaks through the frost that melted as they moved. When the caller finally did speak, his voice was hoarse with memory. He doesn't remember how to talk until he sees a face. He can only whisper what he's learned from listening. But once he sees a mouth, static swallowed the rest. My pulse beat so hard the sound filled my ears like footsteps. Behind me, somewhere deeper in the office, one of my coworkers laughed at something. Chairs scraped. A cabinet door thumped shut. Normal life carried on, not knowing that something was pressing its face to the glass beside me like a child outside a candy shop, waiting to see which expressions I would make. The caller inhaled shakily. He's repeating your name because he likes how it feels in the cold. He practiced it with me, over and over, until my voice stopped working. I flinched. What do you mean, stopped working? A terrible, thin silence stretched. Then he took it. A flash of cold raced through my bones. He took your voice? He takes what you give, the caller whispered. And I was kind. The lights above me flickered, momentarily dimming the entire row of cubicles. Outside, something tapped again. Not a knock, not a fist. Too small, testing taps, as if the thing were trying to mimic knuckles, trying to relearn the gesture. The caller's breath hitched. He's pretending to knock, he said. It's what he used to do. I stared forward, nails digging crescent shapes into the underside of my desk. What did he used to do? He asked for help. The caller answered, a mournful, broken truth. And when no one opened the door, he froze against the glass, staring at their shadows, waiting to be let in. My stomach turned over. I knew, suddenly, horribly, which story he was talking about. The rumor from years before I was hired. The man found frozen outside the old entrance one Christmas morning, collapsed just feet from safety when the security guard didn't see him in the storm. I had dismissed it as a tragedy of timing, a cautionary tale about homelessness and cold weather. A footnote in company gossip, but someone had been out there, trying to be let inside, dying as the building slept, and something left behind had been trying to come back in ever since. He wants warmth, the caller whispered, but he doesn't understand limits. Once you let him in, he stays close, too close, and he gets heavy. He follows you home. He presses against the walls. He breathes through the vents. And if you speak kindly, he keeps coming closer and closer until you start giving him pieces of your voice, too, until you forget which whispers are yours and which ones are his. Outside, the whisper came again, longer now, more confident. Kla. This time, as it dragged its breath across my name, the sound caught on a shape, consonant, a curl, the beginning of a new word it had learned to form. The caller broke. A sob, then a sharp inhale, then, don't let him learn anything more from you. If he knows enough words, he won't need the glass. He'll know how to ask someone else to open the door for him. My whole body tensed. And what do? The caller hesitated, and when he finally spoke, the answer was barely a whisper. You wait. You let him call your name until he gets tired. He always gets tired. But whatever you do, don't respond, don't apologize, don't look, and don't open that window. A pause long enough to tremble through my chest, because once he's warm again, he remembers how to move. Something outside pressed harder against the glass. I felt the pain bow inward a fraction, Snow slid down its surface like tears, and the whisper through the frost turned low, hungry, eager, not calling my name now, but shaping a word I didn't want to hear. Please. For a moment, a stretched, aching, suffocating moment after that whispered, please. I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with the cold pressing through the glass, and everything to do with the part of the human mind that responds automatically to suffering. It was instinct, empathy, habit, the quiet reflex that makes you open doors for strangers, offer blankets, ask if someone's okay. The creature outside the window didn't just imitate desperation. It arranged it, crafted it, wove it into the syllables of my name like bait, coating the word in the tremble of loneliness and cold. I could feel that manipulation like a hook lodged under my ribs, trying to pull me toward the window, trying to make me turn, trying to teach me to become the next unwitting teacher of its borrowed voice. I clenched my teeth hard enough to hurt, nails biting into the underside of the desk as the caller's strained whisper returned threadbare, on the verge of unraveling entirely. Don't feel sorry for him. That's the latch. That's how he got me. I thought I was being kind. I thought someone was hurt. The words hit like ice water poured down my spine. I whispered back barely moving my lips. Why is he doing this? Static swallowed the line for a moment. A long, scratching burst like the sound of wind curling through broken wires, and for a terrible instant I thought the caller had disappeared too, that whatever held him tethered had snapped. But then, faintly, as if he had been pulled under cold water and was using the last of his breath to surface just long enough to speak, I heard him answer, because winter is long, and he is cold, and he can't die anymore. He can only look for warmth, for voices, for faces. My throat tightened. I spoke again without meaning to, the words clinging to the edges of panic. What happens if I look at him? The caller hesitated, and in that hesitation, something tapped twice against the glass, harder now. The window frame trembled. A thin, hairline crack feathered outward from the corner. My heart lurched into my throat. Then the caller whispered, "If he sees you see him, he'll know your shape. He'll know how to follow it. He'll follow you through reflections, hallways, the black parts of windows at night until you stop trying to keep warm, until you let him in." A scraping sound dragged down the length of the window, slow, deliberate, hungry. The frost thinned in streaks, as if he were tracing my outline from the other side, searching for the exact height of my shoulders, the angle of my jaw, mapping me like a cartographer of the living. I stayed absolutely still, breath shallow, pulse hammering so loudly I thought the glass might pick up its rhythm. The caller sobbed once, soft, sharp as if he could feel the thing pressing closer to me. He's trying to finish learning your voice. He only needs one more word from you. Any word. Even a whisper. Anything with warmth in it. My mouth snapped shut so fast my teeth clicked, because I realized every sound I made was being studied, every syllable weighed, every breath measured for kindness. Behind me, far across the hall of cubicles, my coworkers' voices drifted up again, muffled laughter, the ding of the microwave, the rustle of coats being zipped. It was almost midnight. People were preparing to leave early because of the storm. Soon, I'd have to get up too, walk through the dark corridor to the elevator, cross the lobby, step outside. And the thought of opening the lobby door with something waiting beyond the glass, its breath rising in slow, white plumes, froze my blood colder than the window pane beside me. The caller must have sensed what I was thinking. "You can't leave yet," he whispered. "He'll hear the chair slide. He'll hear your coat. He'll know you're getting up. You have to wait until he gets tired." End quote. My voice trembled in my throat, trapped between panic and disbelief. How long does that take? The caller's breath rattled a defeated, distant sound. It took hours with me. My stomach dropped. "And you survived that long?" Another pause. Then a whisper like a broken truth spilling through a dying wire. I didn't. The entire floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my fingers ached. Outside, the whisper pressed against the glass again. Claire. Longer now. More articulate. Each consonant sharpened. Each vowel warm and alive, as if you were adapting, improving, learning precisely how my name should sound when spoken gently. The caller sobbed, breath hitching. He's almost got it. Don't let him hear anything else. Not a word, not a breath he can match. I swallowed hard, praying the tiny motion wouldn't make a sound. The tapping on the glass stopped. So did the scraping. So did the whispering. A deeper quiet settled against the window, heavy, thick, suffocating. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but listening. The snow blew sideways across the parking lot, and somewhere beneath that movement, beneath that storm, something waited with absolute stillness. Then, a slow pressure pushed against the window, a bulging outward, subtle but unmistakable, as if something was leaning its full weight onto the glass, testing its strength, trying to understand how much force the pain could hold before it surrendered. My breath locked. A crack formed near the top corner. Another. The caller's voice broke into panic. Higher and thinner than before. He's trying to get in another way. Clara, you need to stand up. Slowly, my chest constricted. But you said, I know what I said. His voice shook violently, but he's growing impatient. If the glass breaks, he doesn't need your permission. He'll just come in. A slow, deep thud pressed into the window like a palm, or a forehead, or something boneless and heavy testing the limits of the barrier. Clara, the caller whispered urgently. When you stand up, he'll follow the movement, not the sound. That buys you time. Another crack. The pain bowed inward. I rose slowly, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears, trying not to imagine the shape pressed against the other side of the frost. As I stood, the weight on the window shifted, sliding downward, following my height, dragging itself along the glass with a sound like wet fabric tearing. The caller's whisper turned frantic. Go, now. Walk toward your coworkers. Don't run. Don't turn. Don't make a sound. I stepped out of my cubicle. Just one step. The carpet muffled it completely. Behind me, the thing pressed harder against the glass, a sound like suction peeling away, as if something was withdrawing from a surface reluctantly. Walk, Clara, the caller whispered. Walk. I took another step, then another. Then, behind me, the window gave a low, creaking groan, the unmistakable sound of a barrier fatally close to breaking. I forced myself to keep walking, vision narrowing, body trembling. The break room lights glowed ahead, a warm, human glow. And then, right as I reached the row of cubicles, my phone buzzed one last time. I froze, glanced at the screen, the final message from the unknown number. Don't look back. He learns faces fastest. My coworkers turned, smiling at me, oblivious. Hey, Clara heading out? You okay? He looked pale. A sound cracked behind us, sharp, splintered, the window giving way. I didn't turn. None of us did. Not because we knew better, but because the emergency lights flickered on. The building groaned under the storm, and the power stuttered long enough to distract them, long enough for me to walk straight to the elevator, without ever seeing what climbed through the glass. I don't know what the others heard. I don't know what shape moved behind the rows of cubicles after I left. I don't know what the cameras caught. Security refused to show me the footage. But I know this. I didn't go home that night. I stayed in a hotel. I left the state the next morning. I changed jobs, changed numbers, changed everything, and every December since, right when the first real snow falls, and the temperature dips below freezing. My phone buzzes once, from an unlisted number, at exactly the same time each year, 11:13 p.m. No message, no voice, just one vibration, like a fingertip brushing the outside of a window, waiting to see if I answer. If you're still awake, if your room hasn't grown too quiet, then you've made it through all 5 stories of this winter's long vigil. Winter has a way of peeling back the familiar, of reminding us that the world is older than we think, and not nearly as empty. Wherever you are tonight, on a long road home, in a quiet room with the lights low, or lying awake beneath the heavy breath of December, I hope you carry with you a little more wonder, and just enough fear to stay alert when the world grows still. Thank you for spending your night with dread. Until next time, sleep lightly, listen closely, And remember, some stories don't end just because we stop telling them. Good night, and good luck.